NX-1, representative of one of the world's mightiest nations, prodded and stared at by this fish, this octopus. A great rage suffused him, and with a terrific effort he tried to jab his arms into one of those devilish eyes, but try as he might, his body would not respond. He could not move a finger. For a long time the loathsome inspection continued, until the monstrous king seemed satisfied. Wells was handed back. There followed an interminable period in which nothing whatever was done, as far as he could see. He was sure that they must be talking, debating, but no sound reached his ears through the tight helmet. All the time the endless motion in the swarming levels above went on. It became hazy, dreamlike, and in spite of himself the commander began to feel drowsy. The weaving and swaying was producing a hypnotic effect. At last the desire to sleep grew overpowering. Wells and his men were more than half unconscious when their original captors finally pulled them back from the royal presence and began a humble retreat from the throne room. Slowly they backed to the entrance. Keith's last drowsy glimpse was of a grotesque, gold-ringed monster on a throne, with a score of smaller tentacled creatures around him, and a vast haze of weaving tentacles and unblinking eyes above. They passed from the huge chamber. The commander felt delirious, as in a nightmare, but he knew that they were again in the long corridor, and that their captors were taking them further into the mighty building, further from the street outside. He glimpsed great rooms branching off the corridor, and swarms of black octopi inside them. The light became fainter, and at last the procession turned into a separate, rough-walled chamber, dimly lit and empty. Wells felt the grip around his arm loosen, and he floated limply to the floor among his men. He slept. End of Chapter 6. Section 9 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Glass Bell Jar. Keith awoke hours later. Slowly he became conscious of a cramped, stiff body, of a dull pain racking his head. He stretched out his limbs, and suddenly realized he could move. Remembering the paralyzing ray that had struck him down, and half afraid that his senses were tricking him, he kicked his left leg out. It moved with its old vigor. He quickly found that his strength had returned, that he could feel and move. The effect of the ray had worn off. With a glow of new hope, he rose to his feet and exercised numb muscles. Looking around, he saw the other men still stretched out on the floor of their rough-walled, watery prison. He called into his radiophone mouthpiece. "Graham! Graham, wake up!" A grotesque figure stirred among its fellows, turned over. "It's Wells, Graham," Keith continued. "Get up! You can now!" And he watched the form of his big first officer stretch out and finally rise, while stupid, sleepy sounds came to his radio receiver. Why, the paralysis is gone," Graham said at length. "Yes, but maybe the octopi don't know it. Rouse the other men at once, and we'll see what we can do." It was weird, the sight of the lifeless figures of the men stirring to life in the dim-lit water as Graham shook each one's shoulder. The radiophones buzzed and clicked with their excited comments and ejaculations. Keith felt much better. With his men restored to strength and clustered in a determined, hard-fighting mass, he saw a hope of breaking out and regaining the NX-1. He let them exercise as he had for some minutes, then proceeded to a brisk roll call. There should be 15 men and 2 officers. Rapidly Graham ran over the names, and each time a voice rang back in reply, until he came to the cook. "McKegnie? Cook McKegnie?" There was no answer. Wells stared around the group of dim figures and himself called the name again. But McKegnie was not present. And as the commander and his men realized it, the numbing spell of their desperate position settled down on them again like a shroud. Keith shook off the mood. "Well," he muttered, "I guess the devil's got him. Poor McKegnie's seen the wheels go round for the last time. All right. Take command, Graham. I'm going to do a little reconnoitering." The round entrance hole was some 15 feet from him, at the far end of the cell. Keith advanced cautiously to it, the peculiar light feeling the water gave him making his steps uncertain. The dim blue illumination made the details of the corridor outside hazy, shadowy, but it seemed to be empty. Peering out, Wells could sight no guarding octopi. He edged closer and stared down to the left. 20 feet away the vague light tapered into darker gloom, filled with thick, wavering shadows, but it was apparently devoid of tentacles. He wondered if the octopi were unaware that the effects of their ray had worn off, and peeped cautiously around the edge to the right. Immediately a long arm whipped out, grasped him around the waist, and flung him twisting and turning back into the chamber. Graham laboriously made his way to the commander and helped him to his feet. "Hurt, sir?" he asked anxiously. "No," Keith gasped, "but that devil—" He stopped short. The first officer turned and followed his commander's stare. The entrance hole of the cell had filled with a monstrous shape. A huge octopus was resting there, its unblinking eyes coldly surveying the crew of the NX-1. On each of its thick tentacles was a broad band of polished gold. It was the king, the same creature that had inspected them from their throne dais a few hours before, and behind him in the corridor the men glimpsed another octopus. Slowly the ruler of the octopi swam into the chamber, its great eyes centered icily on Keith Wells, standing at the head of his cowering men, and its mighty tentacles waved slowly, gracefully, as if the creature stood in doubt. One of them tentatively reached out and hovered over their heads, moving uncertainly back and forth. Then, like a monstrous water snake, the tentacle poised, flicked out, and plucked a man from his comrades. His shriek of terror rasped in their earphones. "Steady, men!" Keith cried. "It's hopeless to try and fight them. The monster just wants to look him over." The man, Williams, a petty officer, was dangled by the armpit in mid-water, and made to slowly revolve. The tip of another huge arm snaked out and for some seconds stroked his body, probing curiously. He panted with fright, and in their earphones his friends could hear his every tortured exhalation. Anxiously Keith watched. Then, without warning, another tentacle darted up, fastened its tip on the breast of the captive's sea-suit, and deliberately ripped it open. The doomed man's last scream rang in their helmets as the water poured into his suit. They saw him writhe and struggle desperately in the remorseless grip which held him. The two huge eyes of the cuttlefish surveyed his death throes minutely, watched his agonized struggles gradually weaken, watched his legs and arms relax, his head sink lower, and then the tentacle let a lifeless body float to the floor. Jennerby, a huge engineer, went completely mad. "I'll get him, the devil!" he yelled, and before Keith could command him to stay back, had flung himself onto the giant king. Death came as a mere matter of course. Without apparent effort, the monarch ripped off Jennerby's helmet and sent him spinning back. The man's body writhed and shuddered, and in a moment another stark white face showed where death had struck. Trembling, sick at heart, the commander yet had to think of his men. "For God's sake," he cautioned them, "keep back. Don't try to fight now. We've got to wait our chance. Steady! Steady!" The king's deliberate tentacle again began its slow waving. It was choosing another victim, and this time it darted straight out at Keith Wells and gripped him with a mighty clutch about the waist. The commander did not cry out. As he was brought close to the staring eyes and felt their sinister gaze run over him, it flashed through him for some obscure reason that the monster knew him for what he was, the leader, from the tiny bars on each shoulder of his sea-suit. He waited for the tentacles to rip it open, but they did not. Instead, the creature turned and swiftly swam with him out through the entrance hole. They went to the left in the corridor, further into the heart of the building. The bluish light became stronger. As Keith twisted in the giant monarch's grip, he glimpsed the other octopus following with the two dead men. He saved his strength, knowing it was hopeless just then to try and struggle free. Quick as was his passage, he noticed that the walls of the corridor were covered with intricate designs in bas-relief, and colored. He passed row after row of mural paintings of octopi in various activities, and guessed that they represented the race's history. One was obviously a scene of battle, with a tentacled army locked in combat with another strange horde of fish-like creatures. A second showed the construction of the queer mound buildings on the sea floor. with scores of monsters hauling great chunks of material into place, and another pictured the huge audience chamber with a gold-banded king motionless on his throne. As the king drew him rapidly along, he had a glimpse through a circular doorway of a large room, inside which were clustered the black shapes of thousands of baby octopi, tended by what were evidently nurses. Other such rooms were passed, and the young commander's brain whirled as he tried to measure the size and progress of this undersea civilization. Perhaps the race of octopi was growing, reaching out, needed new room to colonize. That would explain why their submarine had been sent through the tunnel. A voice sounded in his ears. "Keith, are you all right?" It was Graham, calling from the cell behind. "So far," Wells assured him. "I'll keep in touch and let you know what happens." At that moment his captor carried him into a large chamber at the end of the corridor. He looked around and decided it was a laboratory. He beheld strange instruments, anatomical charts of octopi on the walls, and in one corner a small jar of glass in which a dull flame was burning. Many shaped, keen-bladed knives lay on various low tables, and thin, wicked-looking prongs and pincers. "I'm in their experimental laboratory, Graham," Wells spoke into the mouthpiece of his tiny radio, and then his roving eyes saw something that made him audibly gasp. "What's the matter, Keith?" came the first officer's anxious voice. After a moment the commander answered, It's a pile of human bodies. The bodies of those fishermen. They've been experimenting on them." Was he, too, Wells wondered, to be experimented on? The sight of that stacked pile of bodies chilled him with horror. He kept his eyes from them till the octopus with the golden bands swung him through a hinged door in the farther wall. He found himself in a side room, smaller than the outer chamber, the whole center of which was occupied by a huge glass bell jar, some 30 feet in diameter. Inside it was much strange-looking apparatus on tables and trays of operating instruments, knives like those in the outer room, and the same thin prongs. The great jar was empty of water, and on one side was an entrance port. The king tossed Keith into a corner and quickly donned a metal-scaled water suit. When he had it all on, and the glass body container fastened into place, he picked up his captive again and advanced through the bell jar's entrance port into a small water chamber. A moment later Wells felt his body grow heavy as the water of the compartment ran out, and then there was a click and he found himself inside the jar, still held in the merciless grip of a tentacle. He twisted around to find the cold eyes of the octopus staring at him only a foot away, and as he wondered what was going to happen next, the king unfastened the glass face shield of the commander's sea suit with a quick flip of the tip of a tentacle. Keith's arms were pinned to his sides. He could not move to try to refasten the face shield. Fearful, he held his breath. Held it until his face was purple and his lungs were near to bursting. But at last the limit was reached, and with a great wrench he sucked in a full breath. It was clean, fresh air. The air was like a breath of his own world brought down to this cold realm of octopi. Once he had caught up with his breathing, it poured new life into his limbs, jaded from the artificial air of the sea suit. Keith felt his muscles respond, felt his whole body glow with the new strength and life. 12 inches away, the king was watching his every reaction closely through the huge helmet of glass. The thought passed through the commander's mind that he was not only king, but chief scientist of this strange water civilization. Then, while his lungs swallowed hungrily the good fresh air, several tentacles began to feel around him in an attempt to unfasten the rest of his sea suit. Wells blanched at the sudden realization of how helpless he would be if the suit were taken from him. He would then not only be a prisoner of the octopi, but a prisoner of the glass jar, unable ever to leave it, and more than ever at the mercy of his captor's least whim. Not that he had any delusion that he would live long in any case. It was just the simple, strong instinct of self-preservation that made him grab at every chance for life. This thought flashed through his mind, even while the octopus was fumbling with the catches of his suit, and along with it was born a desperate plan of escape. He was in his own element, air, the octopus out of his. If he could crack the glass of the king's helmet and let the water out and air in, the glass was only 12 inches away. The commander stopped his resistance, and at the same time felt about with his legs until he had them well braced against a lower tentacle. He pushed gently and came a few inches nearer the glass. A little more. Then, with a quick, strong jerk of his body, he crashed the steel frame of his helmet square against the cuttlefish's sheathing of glass. The creature was taken wholly by surprise. Tentacles whipped out to tear the rash human quickly away, but not before Keith had pounded again and heard the splinter of smashed glass. He had jabbed a hole in the glass body piece, and already the life-giving water was pouring out. Panic seized the king, and he became a nightmare of tortured tentacles. Wells was flung wildly away and fetched up against the side of the jar with a crash that for a second stunned him. More and more water poured from the octopus's suit, and air at once rushed in to take its place. The creature's great eyes became filmy, while the revolting spidery body slewed here and there across the jar, all the time whipping and thrashing at the strangling air. Keith scurried from side to side, trying to keep out of reach of the crazy, writhing tentacles. Once a glancing blow knocked him flat, but the monster was altogether unconscious of him, and he got away. Little by little, the terrific whipping and coiling of the tentacles quieted down. The drowning king lay in one place now, its loathsome red body, no longer protected by glass, turned bluish. Keith thrilled with elation at his victory. And then, for the first time, he noticed that there was a full 3 inches of water on the floor, far too much to spill from the king's suit. A quick look around showed him where it came from. There was a long crack in the side of the glass jar, at the place where he had been crashed against it, and water was pouring in. Keith flung himself against the crack, jammed his arm into the broadest part of the leak, but still the water rushed in. The octopus was in its death throes, weakening steadily, but just as steadily the water poured in and rose up the sides of its body. In a flash, Wells saw that the liquid would win the race to cover it and allow the monster to resume breathing. "Oh, damn it!" he cursed fervently. "Now I've got to run for it." He stumbled to the port, snapping shut his face shield as he went. In a moment he had solved the working of the mechanism and was in the water chamber, then outside in the room itself. Fortunately, his sea suit was unhurt. He thanked heaven for that as he tore away a board-like piece of apparatus and jammed it over the leak in the jar. Keith paused a moment to plan. The king of the octopi was still writhing in ever-weakening struggles, but the water was halfway up his body. "It'll cover him soon," thought the commander, "and then it's a question how long it'll take him to come to. I've got to move fast, slip out into the corridor and run the gauntlet back to the men." His eyes rested on a large knife, and he appropriated it, since he saw nothing else he might use. For the first time since the beginning of the fight, he answered the questions and exclamations that had constantly sounded in his ears from the distant crew. Tersely he told them what had happened, and of the gauntlet he had to run. "Make ready for a dash to the NX-1," he finished. "It's now or never. Wait 3 minutes for me, and if I don't make it, go ahead anyway. Remember, 3 minutes. This is an order. So long, fellows." He shut his ears to the bedlam of comment that followed. His knife ready, he took a few steps to the door and pushed out, right into the tentacles of a waiting octopus. His knife was useless. While locked motionless by 3 arms of his captor, another streaked out and wrenched it from his hand. Once again Keith was absolutely helpless. Great confusion resulted in the laboratory. The commander heard no sound, but the guard must have called, for 5 more octopi darted rapidly out of an adjoining room. Their tentacles writhing in great excitement, they swam past and into the inner chamber to the rescue of their nearly drowned king. The devilfish that held Wells almost crushed him to death in its excitement. It was obviously undecided what to do, but finally it sped him down the passageway and cast him back inside the cell with his men. Then it quickly retreated. The commander staggered to his feet and faced Graham and the others. "A miracle!" he gasped. "I'll tell you later, but now we've got to make our break. The king's out, and we've got to get away before they bring him to. There's nothing to do but rush the door. It means sure death for half of us, and probably for all, but God help us if the king catches us." He paused and surveyed them keenly. "Everybody with me?" he asked, and not one man held back his answer. Wells smiled a little. "Good," he said. There were 12 men and 2 officers. There were thousands of octopi. On the face of it, their chances seemed hopeless. Not for a second did Keith count on getting many men to the NX-1, but he knew where the submarine was, and he had to try. Tersely, he gave them final instructions. "This corridor leads to the main entrance. That is, to the right. Understand? Then straight down the street outside, to the left, is the square where they towed the NX-1. I'd say it was 100 yards. There's one guard outside. Graham, you and half the men to the right of the door. I'll take the rest to the left. Our only chance is to try and destroy the octopus's eyes." His mind cast about desperately for some form of weapon. The only detachable thing on their sea suits was the small helmet light, a thing, Keith told himself, without possible offensive use. Still, the beams would enable them to more clearly see their path and keep together, so he ordered them in hand. The men were grouped and alert. The moment had come. "Remember," he said, "it's eyes. Then stick together and run like hell." "All right. Good luck, and let's go." Awkwardly, stumbling clumsily in the retarding water, the small group surged through the door. Immediately a black shape pounced upon them from the clustered shadows, the guarding octopus. Its tentacles seemed to be everywhere. In seconds 5 men were clutched in its awful grip, their fists rising and falling impotently as the hideous arms constricted and crushed them inward. Keith, free of the clasp, yelled, "The eyes! The eyes! Put out its eyes!" For answer, a yellow arm, clutching a helmet light, broke through the grotesquely milling mass and struck at the cuttlefish's great pools of eyes. It missed, but the switch flicked on, and there stabbed through the gloom a broad, glaringly white ray. Its effect was astounding. The beam smote the octopus squarely in its huge eyes, and immediately the creature shuddered, writhed with pain. The tentacles released the men, and the monster fled back into the protecting shadows. A shout from the men roared in the commander's earphones. "They can't stand the light!" he cried. "Thank God! Beams on, everyone! Flash 'em in their eyes! Forward!" 14 shafts of eye-dazzling light forked through the corridor. The tiny company, beating their path with criss-crossing shafts of white, forged ahead. They thrashed the shadows with their beams, probing each inch of water, clearing their way even as a tank hoses machine gun bullets before its clumsy body. Their former slender chance grew. They filled with hope. Another swarm of devilfish, long arms whipping before them, raced from branching corridors and bore down on the company of humans. The men were ready, and 14 tongues of white met them squarely. They faltered. The weight of their fellows behind shoved them on, but the rays steadied, and the front row of octopi broke in panic. The others at once followed in wild retreat. "Keep together, men," Keith ordered sharply. "One beam to each octopus, straight in its eyes till it retreats. Forward!" They pressed on. The octopi, with eyes used only to the soft blue glow of the cavern, could not stand against the brilliant rays. Keith, leading the NX-1's crew, stumbled out into the street. They faltered a moment when they saw each entrance hole of the mound buildings shooting out streams of octopi. Hundreds were in sight already. The whole city was evidently alarmed. Wells at once formed his men in a circle, so their beams would guard them on every side and above. Apparently the octopi could not approach within 30 feet of them, and even at that distance they turned and fled, writhing with pain whenever a shaft of light struck full in their eyes. "The square's just ahead," the commander roared. "One last rush now, and we'll reach the submarine. Stick close, keep your arms locked, and watch out above." The circle of men narrowed. The eyes gave their tiny cluster the appearance of a monster even more fantastic than those moiling around them. A monster with long, straight tentacles of glaring white. They stumbled forward through the magically parting ranks of black octopi. The beams kept the creatures back. They were helpless before them. Foot by foot, under the inverted bowl of threshing tentacles, the NX-1's crew lumbered ahead. The street at last ceased. The wide square opened before them. "We're here!" Wells yelled exultantly. "This is the—" His voice fell into abrupt silence. He stared around the square, and his heart went cold indeed. They had reached the right place, but it was empty. The NX-1 was not there. End of Chapter 7. Section 10 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tentacles from Below, by Anthony Gilmore. Chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 8. Cook, the Navigator. Through all these hours, one man had remained on the NX-1, and that man was, to put it mildly, scared to death. Cook Angus McKegnie had been nearest the connecting ladder when Keith Wells roared out the command to retreat above, and his desire to regain a place of safety was so earnest that he made the control room in record time. At once he had felt the tingle of the paralyzing ray. Struck by a horrible thought, he ventured to peer down the ladder, and groaned to see the figures of his comrades all lying limply on the deck. His portly frame quivered like jelly as realization came to him that he was the only one who had escaped the ray. Heroic ideas of saving the submarine, of rescuing the men below, flashed wildly through his head, but only for a moment. On second thought, he felt he ought to hide. So in the tomb-like silence that had fallen, the 220-pound McKegnie wormed away behind an instrument panel, effecting the journey by vigorous shoves of his stomach. It was minutes later that he first noticed that some sharp jutting object was jutting deep into his ample paunch. But he could do nothing to remedy it. He was hidden anyway, and he was going to stay hidden. The cook felt the NX-1 being towed forward. Then, after a dreadful wait, he heard queer noises down below, and was positive the exit ports had opened. The snake-like slithering and shuffling which followed would mean that the enemy was inside the NX-1. The thought brought St. Vitus's dance to his limbs, and try as he might, he couldn't still them. Then again the ports opened, the gloomy silence returned, and Angus McKegnie was alone with his reflections. After the first hour, he gave voice to them in one simple, bitter sentence. "Just why the hell," he muttered, "did I ever join the Navy?" The silence offered no reply, and McKegnie, desperate from his cramped position, ventured to poke his head around the instrument panel. The faint emergency lights showed the control room to be empty. He decided to come out, and did so, worming his way back with great difficulty. Once out, the first thing his eyes fell on was the teleview screen. Now the cook had never seen one of the octopi, and the screen showed hundreds of monsters clustering around the NX-1. So with unusual promptness he acted, jamming himself once again into his hiding place. Maybe, he thought, they had some way in which they could see into the control room and discover him. Hours passed. The cook was sopping with sweat. Finally his thoughts emerged into words. "I got to get out of here," he said intensely. "I got to. And I got to run this submarine." The sound of his voice somehow emboldened him. Once more he backed out of his cranny, and with cautious, trembling steps explored the control room. He kept his eyes from the teleview, though it had a terrible fascination for him, and surveyed the NX-1's array of control instruments. The prospective navigator groaned at the sight. There were dozens of mysterious wheels jutting from every possible angle, squads of black and red-handled levers, whole armies of queer little stud buttons and dials. His knowledge of cooking helped him not at all in the presence of that maze of devices. Timidly he touched one of the levers, but immediately snatched his hand away as if afraid it would bite. His boldly announced purpose of running the craft went glimmering. An accidental glimpse of the monsters in the teleview suddenly decided him that he needed a weapon. He hunted frantically through the lockers and found 3 service revolvers, which he fastened at his waist, adding his own carving knife to the arsenal. But he didn't feel much better. Then, remembering for the first time his sea-suit radio, he yelled, "Mr. Wells! Mr. Wells! Oh, Mr. Wells, where are you? Can you hear me?" There was, of course, no answer. He tried to bring his muddled thoughts and fears to order. "I got to run this thing," he said doggedly. "Got to. Now, let's see. What the hell's this thing for? What the—" He broke off short, and his eyes went wide. He had heard a noise. Yes, there it was again, the same peculiar scraping at one of the exit ports. He glanced fearfully at the teleview. "Oh, Lord," he yelped, "they're comin' in to get me." He started to dive back behind the instrument panel, but stopped, drew 2 guns, and in an agonized muddle trotted back and forth for a moment, waving them. Another look at the screen showed that an exit port was open, admitting 2 metal-scaled octopi. McKegnie couldn't stand it any longer. He wedged himself behind his panel again. Soon sounds of the metal tentacles on the deck below told him that one of the creatures was coming up the ramp, then slithering into the control room itself. The cook was a lather of cold perspiration. The octopus was apparently surveying this new part of the submarine. Then, without warning, the tip of a metal-scaled tentacle felt around the panel and crept, exploring, up Angus McKegnie's leg, which leg was again suddenly afflicted with St. Vitus's dance. The tentacles coiled, pulled hard, and the cook, with a yowl, was yanked out into the room. Dangling upside down, high in the air, he submitted to the fishy stare of the great eyes under the sheathing of glass. But soon he started to squirm, and his violent contortions brought a rush of blood to his head, making him quite dizzy. It was while he was in that state that things started to happen. First, a great roar rolled through the NX-1, and McKegnie found himself flat on the floor with his breath knocked out. Then, while this was registering on his mind, he discovered himself the center of a madly milling set of tentacles, and instinctively scrambled out of the way. From a distance he saw that the tentacles belonged to the octopus that had held him, and that their coilings and threshings were gradually dying down, until only a quiver ran through them from time to time. While McKegnie was trying to figure this all out, he noticed that the monster's glass sheeting was shattered, that it lay in a pool of water, and that the odor of burnt powder was in the air. Looking down, he found that he had a gun in his hand. A thin wisp of smoke was curling from the barrel. "Gee whiz!" he ejaculated. "Gee whiz!" As he stood there recovering from his surprise, he heard the other octopus crawling up the connecting ramp, coming to see what had befallen its fellow. Preceded by two trembling guns, McKegnie tiptoed to the ramp and peered down. From the darkness he saw another complicated mass of metal tentacles and glass advancing up toward him. Fear smote the cook, and almost without volition he pointed his guns and pulled the triggers. As before, a bullet crashed into the great dome of glass, and he watched a short but terrible death struggle. He had, by himself, slain 2 octopi. A tremendous elation filled McKegnie, until it occurred to him that his shots might have been heard outside. At once he ran and looked at the teleview screen, and what he saw on its silver surface took all the triumph abruptly out of him. The octopi outside were darting about with alarming activity. A whole cluster of them was centered at the exit port, and even as the cook stared, the preliminary sounds of opening it came to his ears. "Now I got to run this ship," he groaned. He peered at the mass of levers and wheels, put out a hand, closed his eyes, hesitated, and pulled one of them back. Nothing happened. He tried another. The noise below grew, but still the NX-1 remained motionless. Desperate, the cook jerked several other levers. The whine of electric motors surged through the silence. The submarine shuddered and slewed off to the right, as if trying to dig into the sea floor. "I got it started!" he cried. He did something else. The NX-1 stuck her bow dizzily up and sped into the misty blue realm above in a grand sweeping circle. The sea floor with its mound buildings and swarming octopi fell away behind with a rush. "There!" muttered the triumphant cook. "But how did I do it?" The submarine was rising like a skyrocket. McKegnie remembered suddenly that Wells had said the cavern was only a few miles high. He must now be very near the top. He held his breath while he pushed a likely-looking lever the other way. He was lucky. The NX-1 capered like a 2-year-old, kicked up her stern, and bolted eagerly for the depths once more. Again the floor of the cavern rushed up at him. Again he pulled the potent lever back, and again the submarine meteored upward. This procedure went on for some time. McKegnie was only running an elevator. Was he doomed to dash up and down between floor and ceiling forever? He gave forth pints of sweat, now and then groaning as the submarine grazed horribly close to the top or bottom. The dead octopus at his feet slithered limply around on the crazy angling deck. "I can't keep this up forever," the cook said peevishly. "Now, what the hell's this thing for?" He turned it, and the NX-1 tilted in one of her dives and raced forward, midway between ceiling and floor. Her navigator relaxed slightly. He had found the major controls. At least he had been able to stop his dizzy game of plunging up and down. Then, just as he was beginning to wonder where he could go, a large red spot glowed at the edge of the location chart. "Oh, Lord!" he cried. "That's the other submarine, and it's comin' after me!" Evidently it was, for the red spot rapidly approached the green one. The paralyzing ray tingled, and a moment later the enemy's huge bulk loomed on the teleview screen, a band of violet light spearing from one of the jutting knobs. Frantically McKegnie juggled his levers, and then it was that the NX-1 really showed what was in her. She emulated, on a grand scale, a bucking bronco. She stood almost on her nose, and threatened to describe somersaults. She tried it the other way, on her stern. She rolled dizzily. She all but looped the loop, and went staggering around the cavern in great erratic bounds that must have made the octopi think she was in the hands of a madman, which she practically was. Her designer would have had heart failure. In the teleview screen, the frantic McKegnie would see the octopi submarine rush erratically by with a flash of its violet heat ray. The location chart showed the red spot zigzagging drunkenly around the green one. Each boat made occasional short, crazy darts at the other. Sometimes they would stand approximately still. It was a riotous game of tag, and McKegnie knew too well that he was it. During one brief pause, the anguished cook found himself groaning aloud. "Oh, Mr. Wells, where are you? I can't keep this up. I can't!" There were still several important-looking controls that were mysteries to him. But what if he should pull one and open all the exit ports? He shuddered at the thought. Things had become nightmarish. The ship was pitted scores of places by the heat ray. The control room had grown stifling. McKegnie was losing pounds of flesh, and literally stood in a pool of his own perspiration. The octopi craft kept doggedly after the NX-1, no matter how often and effectually the sweating cook's reckless hands prevented her getting the heat ray home. For a long time the two ships continued to race up and down. The NX-1 would plunge, pirouette around the other, and scamper away towards the ceiling as if enjoying it all hugely, abruptly to forsake her course and come zooming down once more. She would weave in romping circles and seem to go utterly crazy as her jumbled navigator pulled his levers and turned his wheels in a frantic effort to get somewhere. To get somewhere. Yes, but where? "Oh, Mr. Wells, where are you?" the harried cook would bleat at intervals. Or, plaintively, "Now, what the hell's this thing for?" Chapter 9. At Bay. 14 humans stood at bay on the cold sea floor, dazed by the ruthless stroke of ill luck which had taken the NX-1 from where they had left it. "It's gone!" whispered Graham over and over in a hopeless tone. Keith tried to pull himself together. He had to think of his men. In a second, his whole plan, which had seemed to be approaching success so rapidly, was smashed by the disappearance of the submarine. Mechanically he kept his helmet light playing into the ever-thickening eyes and tentacles around him, while he scanned the seafloor nearby. It was filling more closely than ever with the black, writhing forms of the cuttlefish. The rays still held them back, but their great bulk loomed over the small party of humans like a sinister storm cloud. Soon, in their overwhelming mass, they would crush down, and the submarine's crew be conquered by sheer force of numbers. "Look!" Keith cried. "There's where she was lying." He pointed out on the floor of the square a deep groove, obviously made by the hull of the NX-1. Its length and jaggedness seemed to denote that the submarine had tried to bore into the bed of the cavern itself. Wells was mystified. If the octopi ship had towed her away, she would certainly not have gouged that deep scar on the sea bottom. But he dismissed the strange disappearance from his mind. He had to work out a plan of action. "Keep together, men, and follow that scar," he ordered tersely. "There's a chance that the NX-1's somewhere further along." It was a futile hope, he knew, but there was nothing else. The tiny group, centered in the inverted bowl of black, writhing tentacles, lumbered onward. Then the octopi struck with another weapon, in an effort to dull the spearing beams of white. Here and there from the mass of black, an even blacker cloud began to emerge. It quickly settled over the whole scene, pervading it with a pitchy, clinging darkness that obscured each man from his neighbor. "Ink!" cried one of them. It was sepia from the cuttlefish's ink sacs, the weapon with which these monsters of the underseas blind and confuse their victims. "Faster!" the commander roared in answer. "And for heaven's sake, keep together!" They huddled closer. Under the protecting cloud of ink the mass of octopi pressed nearer. The struggle became fantastic, unreal, as the brilliant beams of white bored through the utter blackness, searching for eyes which the men knew were there, yet could not see until their rays chanced upon them. Snaky shadows milled horribly close to the little group of bulging yellow figures. Blacker and blacker grew the water. They could not always see the monsters as they drove them back on each side. Now and then a bold tentacle actually touched one of them for a moment, before its owner was thrust, blinded, away. Suddenly the dark cloud cleared a little as the fight moved into an unseen current. Their range of vision lengthened to 10 or 12 feet. They could dimly sense the looming mass of cuttlefish, and it was less often that one of the monsters darted forward, daring the rays of white, and became altogether visible. When this did happen, half a dozen dazzling beams converged on the octopus's eyes and drove it back in writhing agony. The men were the hub of a grotesque cartwheel, whose spokes were intercrossing rays of white. They still forged onward along the groove, but moved more slowly now, and Keith Wells, tired to death, realized the combat could not go on much longer. Their advance was useless, a mere jest. The NX-1 had vanished. It would only be a question of time before their batteries gave out, or the swarms of octopi crushed in on the struggling crew. Their overwhelming numbers would tell in the end. The men were silent, except for the occasional gasps which came from their laboring lungs. And then the king of the octopi appeared. Keith had been wondering, in the aching turmoil that was his brain, where the gold-banded monarch was. He knew the monster had been rescued, and he dreaded coming face to face once more with that huge form. Now, armlets of glittering yellow suddenly flashed in the thick of the besieging tentacles, and two great evil eyes glared for a second at Keith Wells. The commander flung a burst of light at them and laughed crazily as the monster scurried back. For a few moments, the king was not visible. "Well, fellows," Wells said, "it won't be long now. His Majesty's back on the field." He grinned a little through his weary face. "I wonder what he'll hatch up to combat our helmet lights. Watch close. He's damn clever." The commander did not have long to wonder. The vague wall of tentacles began retreating deeper into the ink. Keith could not imagine the reason for it, but held himself taut and ready. His men, likewise, noting the move, unconsciously grouped closer, waiting tensely for they knew not what. The king of the octopi had indeed hatched a plan of attack. After a moment the mass of creatures again became slowly visible, but this time, when the rays shot out, they did not hold them back. Could not, for their eyes were not visible. "My God!" Wells cried. "They're coming backwards!" It was so. The octopi, no doubt under their ruler's orders, had turned themselves around, and now, with eyes directly away from the dazzling shafts of white, were closing slowly in on the humans from all sides. The helmet lights were useless. They could not reach the creatures' eyes. Tentacles coiling, whipping, interweaving, the wall of flesh pressed in. Death stared the helpless crew of the NX-1 in the face. First Officer Graham shrugged his shoulders and said tiredly, "Well, I guess it's all over. Unless," he added with a feeble smile, "somebody figures a way to melt us through the sea floor." Keith Wells's face suddenly lit up with an idea. He swung around and roared, "The hell it's over! We can go up!" His crew understood at once. "What fools we—" Graham began, but Keith cut him short. "Listen," he rapped quickly. "Jam together in one bunch and lock arms tight. When I give the word, flood your suits with air. We'll go up like comets, crash right through the devils. Hurry! All ready?" He saw that they were. "Then together. Go!" he commanded. As one man, the crew adjusted their air controls, bulging the sea suits with air. Their weighted feet left the cavern floor at once, and, locked tightly together, the whole 14 of them shot like a bullet to the living ceiling of unsuspecting cuttlefish above. They hit with a terrific crash. Keith was momentarily stunned by the force of impact. He felt himself torn away from his men, felt a dozen tentacles snake over him, and mechanically stabbed out with his helmet light. For a moment he was held, then the air and his light pulled him through, and he broke out through the top. In his rocketing upward progress, The extra oxygen rapidly cleared his mind. Glancing below, he saw a great, dark, many-fingered cloud dropping rapidly away, and was glad to know that the octopi could not follow him into the lesser pressures above without their suits. Over the dark cloud he glimpsed a few scattered pinpoints of light, the helmet beams of the other men. They were rising as swiftly as he. "Thank God," he murmured reverently. "We broke through. We broke through." End of chapters 8 and 9. Section 11 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tentacles from Below, by Anthony Gilmore. Chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10. The Return of the Wanderer. Wells watched the several helmet lights shooting upwards and wondered if they represented all the men that had got safely through the net of tentacles. Remembering the rocky ceiling they were rapidly approaching, he ordered the others to reduce speed by discharging air from their sea suits. He received no articulate answer. Although he cut down the rush of his own progress, it was with a jar that he bounded to the top of the cavern. As he dangled there, he beheld 4 light beams hurtling upward. His earphones registered crash after crash, and then he saw the beams go spinning down into the gloom again, weaving and crossing fantastically, the shock having jerked them from their owner's hands. Keith had lost his own helmet light below, but peering around he could make out a few vague forms, bumping and twisting in the current. "Graham," the commander called. "Graham, you there?" After a moment his first officer's voice came thickly back. "Yes, here. A bit groggy. That crash—" Wells swam clumsily toward him. "I guess only a few of us broke through," the commander said slowly, as the 2 officers hung at the roof, swinging grotesquely. One by one the other men came to their senses and reported their presence in the radiophone. Keith ordered them to cluster around him, and soon 8 weird figures had grouped nearby. After a while they located 2 others, which brought their total to 10 men and 2 officers. They looked a long time, but could not find any more. 2 were gone. Deep silence fell over the tiny group. The dark mass of the rocky ceiling scraped their helmets. Below, the bluish waters tapered into a thick gloom, hiding, miles beneath, the mound buildings and swarming octopi. One of the men spoke. His words were audible to everyone, and they voiced the thought in every brain. "What are we going to do now?" Keith had no answer. They had escaped the immediate danger, but it was only a temporary respite. The commander knew it was hopeless to try and locate the tunnel leading to the outer sea, for they were very tired, and in their clumsy suits they would be able to swim only a few rods. Their helmet lights were gone. They had played their last card. "They're going to find us after a while," the pessimistic voice continued. "They'll send that submarine of theirs after us, or maybe they'll come up in their metal suits." "Well," Keith replied with forced cheerfulness, "then we'll have to fight 'em off." "Why not rip our suits and end it now?" began another, but Graham's voice cut in sharply. "Quiet," he said. "I heard something." The men stilled abruptly. In tense silence, their ears strained at the headphones. Wells asked, "What did you hear?" "Wait," Graham interrupted, listening intently. "There it is again. Listen. Can't you hear it? Why, it sounded like... Keith concentrated his whole mind on listening, but could catch nothing at all. He was just about to give up when he caught a faint, jumbled murmur, the murmur of a human voice. "My God!" he whispered. The voice, little by little, grew, and Wells could distinguish words. They formed into a complete sentence. Keith heard it plainly. It was, "Now what the hell's this thing for?" Unmistakably, it was the voice of Cook Angus McKegnie, whom they all had thought dead. Amazed, the men of the crew started to jabber. "Quiet!" Wells ordered sharply. He listened again. McKegnie's voice was growing quickly and steadily louder. "McKegnie!" the commander cried excitedly. "McKegnie, can you hear me?" There was no answer. Patiently Wells waited a minute, every second of which increased the volume of his long-lost cook's bewildered tones. Again he tried. "McKegnie, can you hear me? This is Commander Wells. McKegnie." The cook's stammering voice came back. "Why, why, is that you, Mr. Wells? Did I hear you, Mr. Wells?" "Yes," Keith shouted impatiently. "This is Commander Wells. For heaven's sake, McKegnie, where are you?" "I don't know, sir," the cook responded. "Where are you?" Keith was for the moment perplexed. But are you a prisoner?" he questioned, and he could have sworn he heard a distinct note of pride as the invisible McKegnie replied, "Oh, no, sir, not yet. These devils been trying their best to get me, but they couldn't. No, sir." Wells became more and more puzzled. But you're not running the NX 1, are you?" McKegnie's voice was much louder now and growing every second. The note of pride persisted. "Of course, sir," he confirmed. "It was kind of hard at first with these octopuses bothering me, but I got onto it pretty quick. That octopus ship chased me with them heat rays for a long time, but I ain't seen them lately. I guess I kind of tired them out." His last words grew louder with a rush, and from the dark depths beneath a long shape suddenly appeared, hurtling up at the group of astounded men in a zoom that bade fair to take it straight through the ceiling. It was the NX 1. "Dive, man, dive!" Keith yelled. "Cook, pull that black-handled lever towards you. Yank it back, quick!" He sighed with relief as he saw his madly driven submarine pause, whip its nose downward, and crash back for the depths from which it had come. The commander spoke rapidly. "McKegnie, listen. Leave the black lever halfway, so you'll level out. Straighten your helm. We're only a little above you. Come around in a circle till I tell you to stop." The NX 1 came out of her dive, and as the cook evidently shoved her helm over, went skirting around in a wide, drunken circle, some 1,000 feet below her regular crew. "All right," Keith shouted. The fear that the octopi submarine would dart back before he could get aboard his ship was looming in his mind. "You're at the helm, cook. There's a wheel right over your head. Spin it around. Oh, my God, there you go again!" he groaned, while the NX 1 went swooping off on a repetition of her crazy circle. "Sorry, sir," the culinary navigator said thickly. "I guess I got the wrong thing." "Now," Wells roared, "spin that wheel above your head." "That's right. Right. There. Don't touch a thing, cook. We're coming down." The submarine had paused directly beneath them, listing slightly to port. Then began the cautious business of the descent. Under Wells's rapid orders, the men linked arms again and discharged more air from their sea suits. Slowly, thin chains of bubbles rising behind them, they sank towards the dim shape of the NX 1 below. Wells's eyes kept probing the thick gloom far beneath. Every moment he expected to see it disgorge a swarm of octopi. They neared the submarine, and saw numberless pitted spots in her body where the heat ray had stabbed for a moment. In their excitement they missed their level by some feet, but clutching together they admitted more air and soon rose even with the starboard exit port. "Swim forward," Keith ordered. "Hurry!" The weird figures groped clumsily, and very slowly neared the port. The commander, in the van, at last, reached out and gripped its jutting external controls. He could not work them at first. His hands were numb and awkward. As he tugged and struggled with them, a shout rang in his headphone. It was McKegnie, scared to death. "Oh, hurry, Mr. Wells," he yelled. "Quick, quick, please. The octopus ship's comin', sir. The red light's back." Chapter 11. To the Death. He got the door open and motioned Graham and 6 men inside the water chamber. The passage took but a minute. Then he sent the rest of the crew in, being himself the last to enter. When the chamber was finally empty, and Wells had stepped through the inner door onto the lower deck of the NX 1, a great sigh of relief broke from him. Never before had anything looked so good as that brilliantly lit deck with its familiar maze of machinery and bulkheads. "Thank God," he said simply, and his joy was shared by the whole crew. A new feeling had come over them. Back home, in their own submarine, their own element, they had at least a fighting chance with the octopi. But Keith let them waste no time. He knew that a final desperate duel to the death with their foe still was ahead. "Above to the control room," he ordered. "Fast!" They lumbered up the connecting ramp. A disheveled, wild-eyed form met them. Keith couldn't help chuckling as he passed the now much thinner and paler cook, with the arsenal handy at his waist. On the deck of the control room lay a huge tentacled body, metal-scaled, with its dome of glass shattered, and its great cold eyes staring unseeingly away. "I killed him," stammered McKegnie pridefully. "But, Mr. Wells, look at that red light, sir." Keith glanced rapidly at the location chart, ripping off his sea suit as he did. The fateful red stud was moving swiftly down on the motionless green one. The men had surrounded McKegnie, laughing and slapping him on the back, but the commander's terse orders jerked them abruptly back to action. "The rectifiers, Graham. Clean out this stale air. Sea suits off. At emergency posts. Take the helm, Craig. You, Weatherby, trim the ship. No, Cook. Keep away from the controls." The NX-1 balanced herself. Fresh air came rushing in, sweeping out the stale. Keith stared at the location chart, waiting for the submarine to be ready. The red light was almost upon them. "Right," he roared at last. "Diving rudder controls, Graham. Full speed for the tunnel." At that moment the octopi ship swept into view, its full battery of offensive weapons flaring forth. The paralyzing ray tingled again and again over the control room. Someone laughed at its uselessness. The violet heat ray leveled full at them, but the commander avoided it with "Port 10, starboard 10. Maintain zigzag course to the tunnel." He understood the enemy's weapons now. He was throbbing with the fierce thrill of action. This duel was to be the climax of their whole adventure. "And by heaven," he promised, "it's going to be a fight." The other craft seemed to realize the NX-1 was now in expert hands. She raced along to starboard for some minutes, her heat ray trying vainly to steady on the American's weaving form. Wells wondered if the king of the octopi was aboard her, in command. He thought perhaps the ship had postponed her chase of McKegnie to pick him up. "I hope he is," the commander breathed, and fingered the torpedo lever. He had some debts to pay. The NX-1, engines working smoothly, proceeded on a desperate dash for the tunnel that led to the outer sea. But the octopi ship apparently knew what Keith intended, for she abandoned her offensive rays, changed course a few degrees, and slowly but steadily pulled ahead. "Damn!" Keith exclaimed. "She'll get there before us." The dim shape dwindled on the screen, and before long her bulk had disappeared entirely. Wells then could watch her swift, straight progress only on the location chart. 10 minutes later, the funnel-like opening of the tunnel loomed on the teleview, and squarely in front, blocking it, was the waiting form of the octopi submarine. "Quarter speed," Keith snapped. "Hold her steady, Graham. I'm going to try a bow torpedo. I think we're beyond their ray." Sighting his range on the telescopic range finder, he worked the NX-1 slowly into position. He noticed that his first officer was staring oddly at him. He was bothered by the queer look. "What's wrong?" he asked impatiently. "But what about Hemmy Bowman?" Bowman! In the rush of action and suspense, Keith Wells had completely forgotten his officer in the enemy submarine. "Oh, God!" he groaned. The cruel situation that had stayed his hand once before had again come to falter his course of action. The men were watching him. Graham had a question in his eyes. They all knew what had to be decided. Keith shrugged his shoulders hopelessly. It was his greater duty to destroy the octopi submarine. And yet... "Fish for Hemmy, Sparks," he ordered. "Craig, keep present distance from enemy. Full stop." A moment later the radio operator looked up. "Mr. Bowman on the phone, sir." With a heavy weight on his heart, the commander clipped on the extension headphones. "Hemmy? Keith? Keith? Thank God you're alive." Bowman's voice shook with gladness. "You're all back on the NX-1, Keith? The whole crew's with you? Oh, Lord, it's good to hear you again." "Yes, we got back all right, Hemmy. A miracle. They've still got you prisoner?" "Yes." "Keith, you're trying to dodge out of the tunnel, aren't you?" Wells smiled bitterly, and as he paused to frame an answer, Bowman spoke again. "I want you to blow up this submarine, Keith," he said quickly. "A favor to me." He cut Wells short when the commander started to interrupt. "Wait. Let me finish," he pleaded. "I want to explain. I'd been hoping, but never mind that, Keith. A while ago I managed to work loose. I lost my head completely and tackled these devils. It was a foolish thing to do. They overcame me, naturally, but in the struggle they tore my sea suit." "What?" "Oh, just a tiny tear, or I wouldn't have lasted till now. But a leak all the same, in the right leg. Since then I've been gripping the edges of the fabric as tightly as I can, but I couldn't keep the water inside the ship from seeping through. It came in slowly at first, then faster as my hands grew numb. It's up to my neck now, Keith, and it won't be long. I've just a few minutes left." The faint words tapered into silence. "No!" roared Keith in a great rush of emotion. But Hemmy's eager voice came right back. "Oh, yes, you must. It would be a mercy to kill me, Keith." There were tears in the commander's eyes. "Are you sure, Hemmy?" he asked. "Are you sure?" "Oh, yes, it would be a mercy." Wells's lips formed a straight, grim line. His words squeezed through it tightly. "All right, Hemmy. Thanks. Thanks. I'll go after them now, old man. I'll try and keep in touch with you through the duel. But I can't promise." He could almost see Hemingway Bowman give his old familiar smile as he answered, "Then so long, Keith." Commander Keith Wells studied the teleview screen. The men were half afraid to look at his strained, blanched face. Repeatedly the violet beam speared through the water, reaching for the NX-1's bow. "Turn ship. Line up for stern torpedoes," the commander ordered, harshly. He realized he could not hold his submarine steady to obtain a perfect sight, for the heat ray needed only 30 seconds to melt through their shell. He would have to swing the ship slowly about, and, as the shape of the enemy crossed the hairlines on the rangefinder, unleash his torpedoes and gamble on hitting the moving target. The NX-1 swung around, always maintaining a slight forward motion and zigzagging constantly to nullify the heat beam. Wells watched the rangefinder closely. The octopi ship slanted downwards, the deadly violet ray stabbing from her bow. Slowly the black dot that represented her appeared on the dial, and slowly it dropped towards the crossed lines that showed the perfect firing point. Keith grasped the torpedo lever. The NX-1's stern was towards her target. Dead silence hung in the control room. The NX-1 swung slightly. The octopi craft appeared directly in the middle of the dial. Wells pulled back the lever. The hiss of compressed air sprang from her stern. He had fired 2 tubes, his whole stock of stern torpedoes. The pair of dreadful weapons leaped out and settled on their course. Keith shot his gaze to the teleview. The torpedoes missed. Only by feet, but a miss all the same. They raced on past the octopi submarine, and with a tremendous, ear-numbing explosion burst on the wall of the cavern beyond. Both ships reeled from the shock. Graham swore viciously, but Wells's mask-like face showed no slightest change of expression. A voice rang in Keith's headphones. "Tough, Keith. Better luck next time." Then the commander winced. He simply could not answer Hemmy Bowman, could not answer that fine, brave voice. The stern torpedoes were gone. The tubes could not be reloaded, for the paralyzing ray bound the men to the control room. That left them 2 torpedoes in the bow. The violet heat ray kept fingering hungrily on their outer hull, and every man knew that the plates were weakening under the steady strain, which was only lessened by the NX-1's constant zigzagging. The control room was very hot. Both ships were now a full mile from the tunnel entrance. Keith plunged the NX-1 down, swung her around to bring his bow tubes to bear, and zigzagged upwards. It was obvious that the octopi craft had been alarmed by the terrific explosion. They now adopted tactics similar to the American ships, and for a while both submarines circled cautiously, maneuvering for an opening. "If only we could keep the ship steady," Graham muttered. "But then that heat ray'd get us." The commander kept his eyes on the teleview. Again and again the violet shaft pronged at them. The heat grew stifling. Sweat was pouring from all the men's bodies. Every face was strained and taut. "Starboard full," Wells said suddenly. "A little up, Graham." He had seen a chance. The octopi craft was slightly above, and in a moment would pass directly in the line of the bow tubes. The NX-1 stuck her nose up, swung rapidly to the right. Keith pulled back the firing lever, releasing 1 torpedo. The long messenger of death hurtled straight for the enemy's hull. They watched its course breathlessly. "My God!" the first officer groaned. Could they see it coming? For the octopi submarine had swung to one side, neatly dodging the speeding tube of dynamite. One left, he added bitterly. One left. A desperate plan formed in Keith Wells's mind. His last torpedo simply had to strike the mark. He could take no chances with it. He motioned the haggard-faced Graham to him. "There's only one thing left to do," he said quietly. "We've got to deliberately face that heat ray. Chance its puncturing our plates." "How do you mean, sir?" "Get in very close, so as to make our last torpedo sure to hit. We've got to approach the enemy head-on at full speed. We'll corkscrew up to them until we get within 200 yards, then go straight forward for 10 or 15 seconds, giving us the opportunity to sight the remaining torpedo directly on them. The heat ray may break through before I fire, but when I do fire, it's a sure hit." The men had heard every word. Quietly, Wells ordered, "Take the torpedo control, Graham. I'll take the helm." The first officer obeyed without a word. Keith grasped the helm. The plans were made for their last desperate attempt. "Right," the commander said shortly. "Here we go." There had been a taut silence before, but now, knowing that they were deliberately offering themselves a perfect target for the heat ray in order to get their last torpedo home, the intensity was almost unbearable. The men felt like shrieking, jumping, doing anything to break the awful hush. The air was charged with the same unnameable something that heralds a typhoon. Keith Wells was like a white statue at the helm, save for the betraying trickles of sweat that coursed down his drawn cheeks. His hands moved the wheel slowly from port to starboard. His eyes bored at the screen before him. The ship was in command of a man of steel, a man with but one purpose. "Up, up," he ordered. "Hold, in trim, full speed forward." He had brought the NX-1 directly in line with the octopi ship, and now the craft leaped forward under full power, while he shot the helm back and forth ceaselessly. His ship was describing a corkscrewing motion, weaving straight at the enemy. Grasping her opportunity, the octopi submarine remained motionless, steadily dousing the approaching American craft with her silent violet ray, and driving the temperature in the control room to even greater heights. The distance between them rapidly lessened. Would the plates stand it? Would the ray melt through the weakened steel before he could fire? With an effort Keith drove these doubts from his mind, but he could not banish a certain dull, steady ache from his consciousness. The range dwindled. The heat became intolerable. Everyone's clothing was sopping wet. A man ripped off his shirt, gasping for air. Wells kept his eyes on the screen, though half blinded by smarting sweat. The plates had to give soon, he knew. The octopi submarine, beam on and dead ahead, began to move to port at quickly increasing speed. At once Keith stopped swinging the helm, and the NX-1's corkscrewing motion of protection ceased. And then came the real test, the gauntlet of seconds. Right straight into the retreating violet beam they went, at top speed. They gained rapidly. The heat was furnace-like. The commander, watching the rangefinder, kept moving the helm slightly over. A shaft of violet heat spanned the two shells of metal. For 10 seconds it had held on the NX-1. The black dot of the enemy craft moved slowly to exact center on the dial. 15 seconds. 20. 23. Fire! Graham jammed the torpedo lever back. Crash dive. The deck tilted downward, and Wells's white lips formed the words, "So long, Hemmy," and he tore the phones from his head. Seconds later a titanic explosion sounded through the cavern, echoed and re-echoed in vasty roars. The American craft's lights went off, but not before her men had seen, in the teleview, a fire-shot maelstrom where a moment before the octopi submarine had been. "We got them!" yelled Graham. A roar of exultation burst from every throat. The men flung their arms out, jumped, yelled crazily. Faint emergency lights lit the scene. "Below, at regular posts," Wells ordered. "Reload bow and stern tubes. Graham, see to the lights." He himself remained at the helm. In a few moments the submarine had climbed back to the level of the tunnel. At quarter speed she nosed into the wide entrance and slowly forged into the dense, deceptive shadows. The commander acted mechanically. Again by touch he steered his ship through the black, ragged cleft. 15 minutes after leaving the cavern of the octopi, her bow poked through the weaving kelp into the free, salty depths of the Atlantic Ocean. There was one more task to perform, and Wells lost no time in doing it. When 200 yards away, he halted the NX-1, steadied her, and sighted the stern tubes just above the dark tunnel hole. Quickly he sent forth 2 torpedoes. A huge roar rumbled through the water, whipping the beds of kelp to mad convulsions. "Turn around," the commander ordered harshly. He sighted his bow tubes and again let loose a bolt of 2 torpedoes. Then he sent the submarine forward and through the teleview examined what his 4 weapons had done. Huge chunks of rock had been tumbled down, completely closing the tunnel. "Well," said Graham, "it's over. Finished. They'll never get through that." A full-throated cheer burst from the men below, a cheer that rang for minutes as they realized they were free forever of the octopi, of the cold underwater city, of the clutching tentacles. Graham grinned broadly. "Sound happy, eh?" he chuckled. "Say, Keith, it's good we've got those 2 octopi our fighting cook killed. Knapp would never believe our story without them." He stared curiously at his commander. Wells was standing quite still, facing the teleview screen. A strange, faraway look was in his eyes. "What's the matter, old man?" the first officer asked, smiling straight at him. "Aren't you glad we won through?" "Of course," answered Keith, with a tired smile in return. "But why did you look that way?" Graham persisted, and Keith Wells told him. "I was just wondering if Hemmy told the truth." End of chapters 10 and 11. And End of The Tentacles from Below by Anthony Gilmore. Section 12 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Black Lamp, by Captain S. P. Meek. Part A. "The clue, Carnes," said Dr. Bird slowly, "lies in those windows." Operative Carnes of the United States Secret Service shook his head before he glanced at the windows of the famous scientist's private laboratory on the top floor of the Bureau of Standards. "I usually defer to your knowledge, Doctor," he said, "but this time I think you are off on the wrong foot. If the thieves came in through the windows, what was their object in cutting that hole through the roof? The marks are very plain, and they indicate that the hole was cut in some manner from the inside." Dr. Bird smiled enigmatically. "That is too evident for discussion," he replied. "I grant you that the thieves entered from the roof through that hole. After they had secured their booty, they left by the same route. I presume that you have noticed the marks on the roof where an aircraft of some sort, probably a helicopter, landed and took off. A question of much greater moment is that of what they did before they landed and cut the hole." "I don't follow your reasoning, Doctor." "Carnes, that hole was cut through the roof with a heavy saw. In cutting it, the workers dislodged quite a little plaster, which fell to the floor and must have made a great deal of noise." "Why wasn't that noise heard?" "It was heard. The watchman heard it, but knew that Lieutenant Breslau was working here, and he thought he made the noise." "Surely, but why didn't Breslau hear it?" "How do we know that he didn't? He was taken to Walter Reed Hospital this morning with his mind an absolute blank, and with his tongue paralyzed. He must have seen the thieves, and they treated him in some way to ensure his silence. When he is able to talk, if he ever is, he'll probably give us a good description of them." Dr. Bird shook his head. "Too thin, Carney, old dear," he said. "Breslau is a very intelligent young man. He was perfectly normal when I left him shortly after midnight last night. He was working alone in here on a device of the utmost military importance. On the desk is a push button which sets ringing a dozen gongs in the building. Surely a man of that type would have had sense enough, when he heard and saw intruders cutting a hole through the roof, to sound an alarm which would have brought every watchman on the grounds to his assistance. He must have been knocked out before the hole was started, probably before the helicopter's landing." "How? Gas of some sort?" "The windows were all closed and locked, and I have already ascertained that the gas and water lines have not been tampered with. Gas won't penetrate through a solid roof in sufficient concentration to knock out a man like that. It was something more subtle than gas. What was it? I don't know yet. The clue to what it was lies, as I told you, in those windows." Carnes moved over and surveyed the windows closely. "I see nothing unusual about them except that they need washing rather badly." "They were washed last Friday, but they do look rather dirty, don't they? Suppose you take a rag and some scouring soap and clean up a pane." The detective took the proffered articles and started his task. He wet a pane of glass, rubbed up a thick lather of scouring soap and applied it and rubbed vigorously. With clear water he washed the glass and then gave an exclamation of astonishment and examined it more closely. "That isn't dirt, Doctor," he cried. "The glass seems to be fogged." Dr. Bird chuckled. "So it seems," he admitted. "Now look at the rest of the glass around the laboratory." Carnes looked around and then walked to a table littered with apparatus and examined a dozen pieces carefully. "It's all fogged in exactly the same way, Doctor," he said. "The only piece of clear glass in the room is that piece of plate glass on your desk." Dr. Bird picked up a hammer and struck the plate on his desk a sharp blow. Carnes ducked instinctively, but the hammer rebounded harmlessly from the plate. "That isn't glass, Carnes," said the doctor. "That plate is made of vitrolene, a new product which I have developed. It looks like glass, but it has entirely different properties. It is of enormous strength and is quite insensitive to shock. It has one most peculiar property. While ultraviolet and longer rays will penetrate it quite readily, it is a perfect screen for X-rays and other rays of shorter wavelength. It appears to be the only piece of transparent substance in my laboratory which has not been fogged, as you call it." "Do short waves fog glass, Doctor?" "Not so far as I know at present. But you must remember that very little work has been done with the short wavelengths. In the vast range of waves whose lengths lie between 0 and that of the X-ray, only a few points have been investigated and definitely plotted. There may be in that range a wavelength which will fog glass." "Then your theory is that some sort of a ray machine was put in operation before the helicopter landed?" "It is too early to attempt any theorizing, Carnes. Let us confine ourselves to the known facts. Lieutenant Breslau was normal at midnight and was working in this room. Sometime between then and 7 this morning, he underwent certain mental and physical changes which prevent him from telling us what he observed. During the same period, a hole was cut in the roof and things of great importance stolen. At the same time, all the glass in the laboratory became semi-opaque. The problem is to determine what connection there is between the three events. I will handle the scientific end here, but there is some outside work to be done, and that will be your share." "Give me your orders, Doctor," said the detective briefly. "To understand what I am driving at, I will have to tell you what has been stolen. Naturally, this is highly confidential. Some rumors have leaked out as to my experiments with radite, as I have named the new radium-containing disintegrating explosive on which I have been working. But no one short of the Secretary of War and the Chief of Ordnance, and certain of their selected subordinates, knows that my experiments have been successful and that the United States is in a position to manufacture radite in almost unlimited quantities from the pitchblende ore deposits of Wyoming and Nevada. The effects of radite will be catastrophic on the unfortunate victim on whom it is first used. The only thing left to do was to develop a gun from which radite shells could be fired with safety and precision. Ordinary propellant powders are too variable for this purpose, but I found that radite B, one form of my new explosive, can be used for propelling the shells from a gun. The ordinary gun will last only 2 or 3 rounds, due to the erosive action of the radite charge on the barrel, and ordinary ordnance is heavier and more cumbersome than is necessary. When this was found to be the case, the Chief of Ordnance detailed Lieutenant Breslau, the Army's greatest expert on gun design, to work with me in an attempt to develop a suitable weapon. Breslau is a wizard at that sort of work, and he has made a miniature working model of a gun with a vitrolene-lined barrel, which is capable of being fired with a miniature shell. The gun will stand up under the repeated firing of radite charges and is very light and compact and gives an accuracy of fire control heretofore deemed impossible. From this he planned to construct a larger weapon, which would fire a shell containing an explosive charge of 2 1/2 ounces of radite at a rate of fire of 200 shots per minute. The destructive effect of each cell will be greater than that of the ordinary high-explosive shell fired from a 16-inch mortar. And all of the shells can be landed inside a 200-foot circle at a range of 15 miles. The weight of the completed gun will be less than half a ton, exclusive of the firing platform. It is Breslau's working model which has been stolen." Carnes whistled softly between his teeth. "The matter will have to be handled pretty delicately to avoid international complications," he said. "It's hard to tell just where to look. There are a great many of nations who would give any amount for a model of such a weapon. The matter must be handled delicately and also in absolute secrecy, Carnes. We are not yet ready to announce to the world the fact that we have such a weapon in our armory. It is the plan of the President to have a half dozen of these weapons manufactured and give a demonstration of their terrible effectiveness to representatives of the powers of the world. Think what an argument the existence of such a weapon will be for the furtherance of his plans for disarmament and universal peace. Public sentiment will force disarmament on the world, for even the worst jingoist could no longer defend armaments in the face of America's offer to scrap these super engines of destruction and to destroy the plans from which they were made. If the model has fallen into the hands of any civilized power, the damage is not irreparable, for public opinion would force its surrender and return. It is among the uncivilized powers that our search must first be made." "That makes the problem of where to start more complicated." "On the contrary, it simplifies it immensely. At the head of the uncivilized powers stands one which has the brains, the scientific knowledge, and the manufacturing facilities to make terrible use of such a weapon. In addition, the aim of that power is to overthrow all world governments and to set up in their stead its own tyrannical disorder. Need I name it?" "You refer to Russia." "Not to Russia, the great slumbering giant who will some day take her place in the sun in fellowship with the other nations, but to Bolsheviki, that empire within an empire, that horrible power which is holding sleeping Russia in chains of steel and blood. It is there that our search must first be made." "Of course they have no official representative in America." "No, but the Young Labor Party is as much their accredited representative as the British ambassador is of Imperial Britain. Your first task will be to trail down and locate every leader of that group and to investigate his present activities." "I can tell you where most of them are without investigation. Denberg, Semensky, and Karuska are in Atlanta. Fedorovitch and Kasper are in Leavenworth. Saranoff is dead." "Presumably. Why, Doctor, I saw with my own eyes the destruction of the submarine in which he was riding." "Did you see his dead body?" "No. Neither did I, and I will never be sure until I do. Once before we were certain of his death, and he bobbed up with a new fiendish device. We cannot eliminate Saranoff." "I will include him in my plans." "Do so. Besides a hypothetical Saranoff, there are a half a dozen or more of the old leaders of the gang who are alive and at liberty, so far as we know. They fled the country after the Coast Guard broke up their alien smuggling scheme, but some of them may have returned. There are also 30 or 40 underlings who should be located and checked up on, and, in addition, we must not lose sight of the fact that new heads of the organization may have been smuggled into the United States. It is no simple task that I am setting you, Carnes, but I know that you and Bolton will see it through if anyone can." "Thanks, Doctor. We'll do our best. If I am not speaking out of turn, what are you planning to do in the meantime?" "I am going to start Taylor off on an ultra-short wave generator and try a few experiments along that line. Breslau is at Walter Reed, and they are doing all they can for him. But until I can get some definite information as to the underlying cause of his condition, they are more or less shooting in the dark." "How are they treating him?" "By electric stimulations and vibratory treatments, and by keeping him in a darkened room. By the way, Carnes, if I am correct in my line of thought, it would be well to have an extra guard put over Karuska. He was the only real expert in ordnance that the Young Labor Party had, and if they have Breslau's model, they'll need him to supervise the construction of a gun." "I'll attend to that at once, Doctor. Is there anything else?" "Not that I know of. I am going out to Tacoma Park this afternoon and have another look at Breslau, but it is too soon to hope for any change in his condition. Aside from the time I will be out there, You can find me either here or at my home, in case anything develops." "I'll get on the job at once, Doctor." "Thanks, old dear. Remember that speed must be the keynote of your work." The telephone bell at the head of Dr. Bird's bed woke into noisy activity. The doctor roused himself and took down the instrument sleepily. A glance at the clock showed him that it was 4 in the morning, and he muttered a malediction on the one who had called him. "Hello," he said into the receiver. "Dr. Bird speaking." "Doctor," came a crisp voice over the wire. "Wake up. This is Carnes talking. Something has broken loose." All trace of sleep vanished from Dr. Bird's face, and his eyes glowed momentarily with a peculiar glitter which Carnes would at once have recognized as indicative of the keenest interest. "What has happened, Carnes?" he demanded. "I telephoned Atlanta this morning and arranged to have an extra guard put over Karuska as you suggested. The matter was simplified by the fact that he and 9 others were confined in the prison infirmary. The warden agreed to do as I told him, and, in addition to the regular guards, a special man was placed in the ward near Karuska's bed. At 2 a.m. the lights in the ward went out." "Accidentally, or were they put out?" "They haven't found out yet. At any rate, they are all right now. But Karuska and all of the other inmates and all the guards of that particular ward have gone crazy." "The dickens you say!" "Not only that, they are also partially paralyzed. The description I got over the telephone corresponds exactly with the condition of Lieutenant Breslau as you described it to me. Here is the most interesting part of the whole affair. The special guard over Karuska was only lightly affected and has already recovered and is in a position to tell you exactly what happened. I got a garbled account of the affair from the warden, something about a goldfish bowl or something like that. The warden wouldn't take it seriously enough to give me details. I didn't press for them much, for I knew that you would rather get them at first hand." "I certainly would. I'll be ready to leave for Atlanta in less than 10 minutes. I expected that, Doctor, and a car is already on its way to pick you up. I'll meet you at Langley Field, where a plane is already being tuned up and will be ready to take off by the time we get there." "Good work, Carnes. I'll see you at the field." A car was waiting for Carnes and Dr. Bird when the Langley Field plane slid down to a landing at Atlanta. At the penitentiary, Dr. Bird went direct to the infirmary where Karuska had been confined. As he entered, he shot a keen glance around and gave an exclamation of satisfaction. "Look at the windows, Carnes," he cried. Carnes went over to the nearest window and moistened his fingertip and applied it experimentally to the glass. The moisture produced no effect, for the glass of the windows was permanently clouded, as was that of the doctor's laboratory. "Whatever happened in my laboratory the night before last was repeated here last night with a similar object," said the doctor. "The object there was to steal a gun model. Here it was to steal a man who could construct a full-sized gun from the model. I understand that one of the guards escaped the fate which overtook the rest of the persons in the infirmary?" "Not altogether, Doctor," replied the warden. "I think that his mind is somewhat affected, for he tells a wild yarn and insists on trying to wear a goldfish bowl on his head. I have him under observation in the psychopathic ward." Dr. Bird shot a scornful glance at the warden. "There are none so blind as those who will not see," he murmured. "By all means, I wish to see him," he went on aloud. "Will you have him brought here at once, please?" The warden nodded and spoke to one of the attendants. In a few moments a tall, fair-haired young giant stood before the doctor. Dr. Bird pushed back his unruly shock of black hair with his fingers, those long, slim, mobile fingers which alone betrayed the artist in his make-up, and shot a piercing glance from his black eyes into the blue ones, which returned the gaze unabashed. "What is your name?" he asked. "Bailey, sir." "You were on guard here last night?" "Yes, sir. I was detailed as a special guard over number 9764. "Tell me in your own words just what happened. Don't be afraid to speak out. I'm not going to disbelieve you. And above all, tell me everything, no matter how unimportant it may seem to you. I'll judge the importance of things for myself. I'm Dr. Bird of the Bureau of Standards." The guard's face lighted up at the doctor's words. End of Part A. Section 13 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Black Lamp, by Captain S.P. Meek. Part B. "I've heard of you, Doctor," he said in a relieved tone, "and I'll be glad to tell you everything. At 10 o'clock last night I relieved Carragher as special guard over number 9764. Carragher reported that the prisoner was somewhat restless and hadn't been asleep as yet. I sat down about 15 feet from his bed and prepared to keep an eye on him until I was relieved at 6 o'clock this morning. Nothing happened until about 2 o'clock. Number 9764 was restless, as Carragher had said, but toward midnight he quieted down and apparently went to sleep. I was sleepy myself, and I got up and took a turn around the room every 5 minutes to be sure that I kept awake. That's how I am sure of the time, sir." Dr. Bird nodded. "At 5 minutes to 2, just as I got up, I heard a noise outside like a big electric fan. It sounded like it came from directly overhead, and I went to the window and looked out. I couldn't see anything, although I could hear it pretty plainly, and then I heard a noise like something had fallen on the roof. Almost at the same time there came a sort of high-pitched whine, a good deal like the noise an electric motor makes when it is running at high speed. I thought of giving an alarm, but I didn't want to stir things up unless I was sure that there was some necessity for it, so I started for the door to ask one of the outside guards if he had heard anything. As I turned toward number 9764, I saw that he had been sitting up in bed while my back was turned. As soon as he saw that I noticed him, he lay back real quick and pulled the covers over his head. He moved pretty quick, but not so quick that I couldn't see that he had something that glittered like glass before his face. I started over toward his bed to see what he was doing, and then it was that the lights started to get dim." "Go on," said the doctor, as Bailey paused. His eyes were glittering brightly now. "Well, Sir Doctor, I don't hardly know how to describe what happened next. The lights were getting dim, but not as they ordinarily do when the current starts to go off. The filaments were shining as bright as they ever did, but the light didn't seem to be able to penetrate the air. The whole room seemed to be filled with a blackness that stopped the light. No, sir, it wasn't like fog. It was more like something more powerful than the lights was in the room and was killing them. It wasn't only the lights which were affected, it was me as well. This blackness, whatever it was getting into me as well as into the room, and I couldn't seem to make myself think like I wanted to. I tried to yell to give an alarm, and I found that I could hardly whisper. I went toward the bed, and then I saw number 9764 sit up again. He had a goldfish bowl pulled down over his head, and it was evident that it was keeping the blackness away, for I could see him plainly, and his eyes were as bright as ever. The nearer I got to him, the funnier I felt, and I began to be afraid that I would go out. Number 9764 got up out of bed, and I could see him grinning at me through the bowl. He reached up and adjusted that bowl, and all of a sudden I realized that whatever was knocking me out was not affecting him, because he had that thing on. I jumped for him with the idea of taking the bowl off and putting it on my own head. He saw what I was up to, and he fought like a cornered rat, but the blackness hadn't affected my muscles. I'm a pretty big man, sir, and number 9764 is a little runt, and it didn't take me long to get the bowl off his head and pulled on over mine. As soon as I did that, I seemed to be able to think clearer. I was sitting on number 9764 and was ready to tap him with a persuader if he started anything, but I didn't have to. In a few minutes he stopped struggling and lay perfectly quiet. The lights kept getting dimmer and dimmer until they went out altogether and the room became pitch dark. It wasn't exactly as if the lights had gone out, sir. I seemed to know that they were still there and were burning bright as ever, but they couldn't penetrate the blackness in the room, if you understand what I mean." "I think I do," said Dr. Bird slowly. "It was a good deal as if you had seen a glass filled with a pale red liquid, and someone had dumped black ink into the fluid and hid the red color. You would know that the red was still there, but you wouldn't be able to see it through the black." "That's exactly what it was like, Doctor. You have described it better than I can. At any rate, after it got real dark, I heard a low whistle from the roof. Number 9764 made a struggle to get up for a moment, and then lay quiet again. The whistle sounded again, and then I heard someone call Caruso. Everything was quiet for a while, and then the same voice called again and said some stuff in a foreign language that I couldn't understand. I kept perfectly quiet to see what would happen. For about 10 minutes the room remained perfectly dark, as I have said, and all the while I could hear that whining noise. All of a sudden it began to sound in a lower note, and then I could see the lights again, very dimly, and like the black ink you spoke of was fading out. The note got lower until it stopped altogether, and the lights came on brighter until they were normal again. Then I heard a scraping noise on the roof, and the noise I had heard at first like a big electric fan. I looked at the clock. It was 2:20. For a few minutes I wasn't able to collect my wits. When I got up off of number 9764 at last, he stared at me as though he didn't know a thing, and I heaved him back into his bed and ran to the door to summon an outside guard. I could still talk in a husky whisper, but not loud, and I wasn't surprised when no one heard me. My orders were not to let number 9764 out of my sight, but this was an emergency, so I left the ward and found a guard. It was Madigan, and he was standing on his beat, staring at nothing. When I touched him he looked at me, and there was the same vacant look in his eyes that I had seen in the prisoner's. I talked to him in a whisper, but he didn't seem to understand, so I left him and went to a telephone and called for help. Mr. Lawson, the warden, got here with guards in a couple of minutes, and I tried to tell him what had happened, but I couldn't talk loud, and I was afraid to take the fish bowl off my head. What happened next? Mr. Lawson took me to his office, and on the way we passed under an arc light. As soon as I got under it, I began to feel better, and my voice came stronger. I saw that it was doing me some good, and I stopped under it for an hour before my voice got back to normal. It seemed to clear the fog from my brain, too, and I was able, about 4 o'clock, to tell everything that had happened. Mr. Lawson seemed to think that my brain was affected as well as the others, and he sent me to the hospital. That's all, Doctor. Do you feel perfectly normal now? Yes, sir. There is no need for confining this man longer, Mr. Lawson. He is as well as he ever was. Carnes, get the Walter Reed Hospital on the telephone and tell them that I said to treat Lieutenant Breslau with light rays, rich in ultraviolet. Tell them to give him an overdose of them and not to put goggles on him. Keep him in the sun all day and under sun ray arcs at night until further orders. Mr. Lawson, give the same treatment to the men who were disabled last night. If you haven't enough sun ray arcs in your hospital, put them under an ordinary arc light in the yard. Bailey, have you still got that goldfish bowl? It is in my office, Doctor, said the warden. Good enough. Send for it at once. By the way, you have 2 more communists here, Denberg and Semensky, haven't you? I think so, although I will have to consult the records before I can be positive. I am sure you have. Look the matter up and let me know. The warden hurried away to carry out the doctor's orders, and an orderly appeared in a few moments with a hollow globe made of some crystalline, transparent substance. Despite its presence in the infirmary the evening before, there was no trace of clouding apparent. Dr. Bird took it and examined it critically. He rapped it with his knuckles, and then stepped to the door and hurled it violently down on the concrete floor of the yard. The globe rebounded without injury, and he caught it. Vitrilene, or a good imitation of it, he remarked to Carnes. After you get through talking to the hospital, get Taylor on the wire. There is plenty of loose vitrilene in the bureau, and I want him to send down about 50 square feet of it by a special plane at once. As Carnes left the room, the warden reappeared. The men are all lying in the sun now, Doctor, he said. I find that we have the 2 men you mentioned confined here. They are both in Tier A, Building 6. Is that an isolated building? No, it is one wing of the old main building. On which floor? The 2nd floor. It is a 6-story building. Have they been moved there recently? They have been there for nearly a year. In that case, there will be little chance of another attack of this sort tonight. At the same time, I would advise you to station extra guards there tonight and every night until I notify you otherwise. Caution them to watch the lights carefully and to give an alarm at once if they appear to get dim. In such a case, send men to the roof with rifles with orders to shoot to kill anyone they find there. I am going back to Washington, and I am going to take Karuska, your number 9764, with me. You had better have one of the guards in the corridor, where Denberg and Semensky are, wear this goldfish bowl, as you call it. A lot of plate glass, at least it will look like that, will come from Washington by plane. Cut it into sheets a foot square, and use surgeon's plaster to make some temporary glass helmets for your men. I want all your guards to wear them until I either settle this matter or else send you some better helmets. You understand?" "I understand all right, but I'm afraid I can't do it. The wearing of such appliances would interfere with the efficiency of my men as guards. Brain and tongue paralysis would interfere rather more seriously, it seems to me. In any event, I have sufficient authority to enforce my request. If you are at all doubtful, call up the Attorney General and ask him." The warden hesitated. "If you don't mind, I think I will call Washington, Doctor," he said. "I will have to get authority to turn number 9764 over to you in any event." "Call all you wish, Mr. Lawson. Mr. Carnes is talking to Washington now, and we'll have a clear line through for you in a few minutes. Meanwhile, get a set of shackles on Karuska, and get him ready to travel by plane. He appears to be suffering from mental paralysis, but I don't know how his case will develop. He may go violently insane at any moment, and I don't care to be aloft in a plane with an unbound maniac." Major Martin looked up from the prone figure of Karuska. "His condition duplicates that of Lieutenant Breslau, Dr. Bird," he said. "We received your telephoned message this afternoon, and we kept Breslau in a flood of sunlight until dusk, and then put him under sun ray lamps. I don't know how you got on to that treatment, but it is having a very beneficial effect. He can already make inarticulate sounds, and his eyes are not quite as vacant as they were. If he keeps on improving as he has, he should be able to talk intelligently in a few days. If you wish to question this man, why not give him the same treatment?" "I haven't time, Major. I must make him talk tonight, if it is humanly possible. I called you in because you are the most eminent authority on the brain in the government service. Is there any way of artificially stimulating this man's brain, so that we can force the secrets of his subconscious mind from him?" The Major sat for a moment in profound thought. "There is a way, Doctor," he said at length, "but it is a method which I would not dare to use. By applying high-frequency electrical stimulations to the medulla oblongata, at the same time bathing the cerebellum with ultraviolet, it might be done, but the chances are that either death or insanity would result. I would not do it. Major Martin, this man is a reckless and dangerous international criminal. If his gang carries out the plan which I fear they have formed, the lives of thousands, yes, of millions, may pay for your hesitation. I will assume full responsibility for the test, if you will make it, and I have the authority of the President of the United States behind me." "In that case, Doctor, I have no choice. The President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and if those are his orders, the experiment will be carried out. As a matter of form, I will ask that your orders be reduced to writing." "I will write them gladly, Major. Please proceed with the experiment without delay." Major Martin bowed and spoke to a waiting orderly. The prostrate figure of Karuska was wheeled down a corridor into the electrical laboratory, and with the aid of the laboratory technician the surgeon made his preparations. The Moss lamp was arranged to throw a flood of ultraviolet over the Russian's cranium, while the leads from a deep therapy X-ray tube were connected, one to the front of Karuska's throat and another to the base of his brain. At a signal from the Major, a nurse began to administer ether. "I guarantee nothing, Dr. Bird," said the Major. "The paralysis of the vocal cords may be physical, in which case the victim will still be unable to speak, regardless of the brain stimulation. If, however, the evident paralysis is due to some obscure influence on the brain, it may work. In any event, I will hold you blameless and thank you for your help," replied the doctor. "Please start the stimulation." Major Martin closed a switch, and the hum of a high-tension alternator filled the laboratory. The Russian quivered for a moment, then lay still. Major Martin nodded, and Dr. Bird stepped to the side of the operating table. "Ivan Karuska," he said slowly and distinctly, "do you hear me?" The Russian's lips quivered, and an unintelligible murmur came from them. "Ivan Karuska," repeated Dr. Bird, "do you hear me?" There was a momentary struggle on the part of the Russian, and then a surprisingly clear voice came from his lips. "I do." "Who is the present head of the Young Labor Party?" Again there was a pause before the name Saranoff came from the lips of the insensible figure. Carnes gave a sharp exclamation, but a gesture from the doctor silenced him. "Is Saranoff alive?" "Yes." "Is he in the United States?" "No. He is in London." "Is he coming to the United States?" "Yes." "When?" I don't know. Soon. As soon as we are ready for him. Where is he living in London? I don't know. How did you get word that you were to be rescued from Atlanta? A message was smuggled to me by O'Grady, a guard in our pay. What was that vitrilene helmet for? To protect me from the effects of the black lamp. What is the black lamp? I don't know exactly. Saranoff invented it. It gives a black light and it kills all other light except sunlight. And it paralyzes the brain. Did you know that the model of the Breslau gun had been stolen? Yes. What were you going to do after you were rescued from jail? I was going to make a full-sized gun. We have a disappearing gun platform built in the swamps at the juncture of the Potomac and Piscataway Creek. The gun was to be mounted there, and we would shell Washington and institute a reign of terror. It would be a signal for uprisings all over the country. Is there a black lamp at that gun platform? Yes. The black lamp will kill both the flash and the report. Where did you get the formula for radite? We got it from one of Dr. Bird's assistants. His name... As he spoke the last few sentences, Karuska's voice had steadily risen almost to a shriek. As he endeavored to give the name of the doctor's treacherous helper, his voice changed to an unintelligible screech, and then died away into silence. Major Martin stepped forward and bent over the prone figure. Hurriedly he tore away the electrical connections and placed a stethoscope over the Russian's heart. He listened for a moment and then straightened up, his face pale. "I hope the information you obtained is worth a life, Dr. Bird," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "because it has cost one. It may easily save thousands of lives. I thank you, Major, and I will see that no blame attaches to you for your actions. I only wish that he had lived long enough to tell me the name of my assistant who has sold me to Saranoff. However, we'll get that information in other ways. Carnes, telephone Lawson at Atlanta to slam O'Grady into a cell pending investigation, while I get Camp Meade on the wire and order up a couple of tanks. We are going to attack that gun emplacement at daybreak." The telephone bell in the laboratory jangled sharply. Major Martin answered it and turned to Carnes. "You're wanted on the telephone, Mr. Carnes." The detective stepped forward and took the transmitter. "Carnes speaking," he said. "Yes. Oh, hello, Bolton. Yes, we have Karuska here, or rather his body. Yes, Dr. Bird is here right now. You've what? Great Scott, wait a minute. Dr. Bird," he cried eagerly, turning from the telephone, "Bolton has located the Washington headquarters of the Young Labor Party." Dr. Bird sprang to the instrument. "Bird speaking, Bolton," he cried. "You've located their headquarters? Who's running it? Stanesky, eh? You're on the right track. He used to be Saranoff's right-hand man. Where is the place located? I don't seem to recollect the spot. You have it well surrounded? Where are you speaking from? All right, we'll join you as quickly as we can. Keep your patrols out and don't let any one get away." He hung up the receiver and turned to Carnes. "Did you have the car wait?" he asked. "Good enough. We'll jump for the Bureau and pick up all the vitrilene lying around loose and then join Bolton. He thinks that he has the whole outfit bottled up." Bolton was waiting as the car rolled up, and Dr. Bird leaped out. "Where are they?" demanded the doctor eagerly. "In an abandoned factory building about 300 yards from here," replied the chief of the Secret Service. "I traced them through New York. We have been watching the place ever since yesterday noon, and I know that Stanesky is in there with half a dozen others. No one has tried to leave since we set our watch. One funny thing has happened. About an hour ago a peculiar red glow suffused the whole building. It has died down a good deal since, but we can still see it through the windows. Could you tell us what it means?" "No, I couldn't, Bolton, but we'll find out. How many men have you?" "I have 16 stationed around. That's more than we'll need. I have only vitrilene shields and helmets enough to equip 6 men. Pick out your 3 best men to go with us, and we'll make a try at entering." Bolton strode off into the darkness and returned in a few moments with 3 men at his heels. Dr. Bird spoke briefly to the operatives, all of them men who had been his companions on other adventures. He explained the need for the vitrilene helmets and shields. and without comment the six donned their armor and followed Bolton as he strode toward the building. As they approached, a dull red glow could be plainly seen through the windows, and Dr. Bird paused and studied the phenomenon for a moment. "I don't know what that means, Bolton," he said softly, "but I don't like the looks of it. Stanesky is up to some devilment or other. I wouldn't be a bit surprised to find out that he knows all about your pickets and is ready for a raid." "We'd better rush the place, then," muttered Bolton. Dr. Bird nodded agreement, and with a sharp command to his men, Bolton broke into a run. Not a shot was fired as they approached, and the front door gave readily to Bolton's touch. As it opened, there came a grating sound from the roof, followed by the whir of a propeller. Dr. Bird ran out of the building and glanced up. "A helicopter!" he cried. "They were expecting us and have escaped." He drew his pistol and fired ineffectually at the great bird-like ship which was rising almost noiselessly into the air. He cursed and turned again to the building. Bolton still stood in the room which they had first entered. His flashlight showed it to be empty, but from under a door on the opposite side a line of dull red light glowed evilly. With his pistol ready in his hand, Bolton approached the door on hands and knees. When he reached it, he threw his shoulder against it and dropped flat to the floor as the door swung open. No shot greeted him, and he stared for a moment and then rose to his feet. End of Part B. Section 14 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Black Lamp, by Captain S.P. Meek. Part C. "Nothing in here but some glass statues," he announced. Dr. Bird followed him into the room. As he looked at what Bolton had called glass statues, he gasped and shielded his eyes. "God in heaven!" he ejaculated. "Those were living men." Before them were three men, or what had been three men. All stood in strained attitudes with a look of horror frozen on their faces. The thing that made the spectators shudder was that their bodies had, by some diabolical method, been rendered semi-transparent. The dull red light which suffused the room emanated from the three bodies. Dr. Bird examined them closely, being careful not to touch them. "The identity of my treacherous assistant is known," he said grimly as he pointed at the middle figure. It was Gerond. "What is this?" He took an envelope from the hand of the middle figure and opened it. A sheet of paper fell out, and he picked it up and read it. "My dear Mr. Bolton," ran the note, "your methods of tracing and picketing my headquarters are so crude as to be almost laughable. This base has served its purpose, and we were ready to abandon it in any event, but I couldn't resist the temptation to let you almost nab us. The three men whom you will find here are agents who failed in their duty. If you are interested in learning the method of their execution, you might take to heart the words of your colleague, Dr. Bird. The clue lies in those windows." Carnes glanced at the windows and gave a cry of surprise. The glass was opaque, as had been the glass in the doctor's laboratory and the glass in the infirmary at Atlanta. The fogging, however, was much more pronounced, and the opaque glass gave faintly the same red effulgence which came from the three bodies. "What does it mean, Doctor?" he asked. "I don't know, Carnes," said Bird slowly. "I foresee that I am going to have to do a great deal of work on short wavelengths soon. It is doubtless the effect of some modification of the black lamp which has done it. Look out!" He leaped to one side as he spoke, drawing Bolton and Carnes with him. A panel in the side of the wall opposite the doorway had slid silently open, and through the opening poured out a beam of fiery red. Full on the three bodies it fell, and then spread out to fill the room. Dr. Bird had drawn the two nearest men out of the direct beam, but one of the Secret Service men stood full in its path. In the excitement of entering, he had dropped his vitrilene shield, and the livid ray fell full on his defenseless body. As they watched, an expression of horror spread over his face, and he strove to move to one side, but he was held helpless. Slowly he stiffened, and, as the ray bored through him, his body became semi-transparent, and the same dull red glow which emanated from the three bodies they had found began to shine forth from him. Bolton strove to break from the doctor's grasp and rush to the rescue, but Dr. Bird held him with a grip of iron. "Too late," he said grimly. "Chalk up another murder to the arch-fiend who has committed the others. I don't know the nature of that ray, and vitrilene may not be an adequate defense against its full force. We had better get out of here and attack the place from the rear." Carefully edging their way around the sides of the room, the five men made their way through the door. Dr. Bird slammed the door shut behind him and led the way out of the building and around to the rear. A door loomed before them, and he cautiously tried it. It gave to his touch, and he entered. As he set his foot on the threshold, a terrific explosion came from the interior of the building. "Run!" he shouted as he led the way in retreat. "If that is a radite explosion, it will act for several seconds." From a safe distance they watched. One corner of the building had been torn off by the force of the explosion, and as they watched, the rest of the building gradually collapsed and sank into a pile of ruins. "They had planned on a visit from us, all right," said Dr. Bolton grimly. "They had a surprise for us any way we jumped. If we went in the front door, the devil's ray was to finish us, and if we went in the back door, the whole place was arranged to blow up as we entered. I only hope that Stanesky thinks that he has got us all and doesn't expect an attack on his next base in the morning. If he doesn't, I think we may give him a rather unpleasant surprise. Of course, that lamp is smashed into atoms and buried under the debris, but I don't know what other devil's contraptions that ruin holds. Bolton, have your men picket it and allow no one near until I get back. I've got to get to a telephone and get a couple of tanks from Meade and a plane or two from Langley Field." Two tanks made their way slowly across country. The front of each tank was protected by a heavy sheet of vitrilene, while from the turrets of the tanks projected the wicked-looking muzzles of 37mm guns. Overhead, two airplanes from Langley Field roared, scouting the country. Dr. Bird and Carnes rode in the leading tank. "It ought to be somewhere near here, unless Karuska lied," said Carnes, as he swept the country with a pair of binoculars. "He didn't lie," returned Dr. Bird. "It was his subconscious mind that spoke, and it never lies. He spoke of the gun emplacement as being in a swamp, and I have a strong idea that it is submersible. Of course, it is bound to be well camouflaged, both from land and from air observation." The planes circled around again and again, quartering the air like a pair of well-trained bird dogs will quarter a hunting field. First high and then low, they swooped back and forth, the tanks lumbering slowly along in the same direction. Presently the occupants of the leading tank saw one of the planes bank sharply and swing around. It dropped to an altitude of only a few hundred feet, and turned and went back over the ground it had just crossed. "I believe that fellow sees something," exclaimed Carnes. As he spoke, three green vari-lights came from the cockpit of the plane. The tank driver gave a grunt of satisfaction and turned the nose of his vehicle in that direction. The second tank followed. Hardly had they turned in the new direction before the ground began to get soft under their tracks and the heavy vehicles began to sink. The driver of the doctor's tank forced it ahead, but the tank sank deeper in the mire until water flowed in around the feet of the occupants. "I reckon we'll have to get out and walk pretty soon, Doctor," said the driver. Dr. Bird grunted in acquiescence. The tank made its way forward a few yards before the engine sputtered and died. The second tank stopped when the first one did, 50 yards behind it. Donning vitrilene helmets and taking vitrilene shields in their hands, the crews of both tanks climbed out into the waist-deep water and gathered around the doctor for orders. "Form a skirmish line at 10-pace intervals and cross the swamp," he directed. "We may meet with no opposition, but if there is, the more scattered we are, the safer we will be. You all have hand grenades as well as your rifles?" A murmur of assent answered him, and the line formed and started across the swamp. They had gone perhaps 100 yards when three red lights came from one of the planes circling overhead. "Down!" cried the doctor, dropping to his knees in the muck. 400 yards ahead of them a concrete platform emerged from the marsh and rose slowly into the air. It was roofed with a dome of what looked like plate glass, but which the doctor shrewdly suspected was vitrilene. When the base of the platform was 2 feet above the level of the water, the dome slid silently aside, disclosing two men bending over a tiny gun. Dr. Bird leveled his binoculars. "That's the Breslau gun model that was stolen as sure as I'm a foot high," he cried. They must have made some miniature shells and be planning to fire it. Slowly a pall of intense blackness rose from the marsh and enveloped the platform, and hid it from view. A whining noise came from overhead, and then a crash like a thunderbolt. The blast of the explosion threw the attackers face down in the swamp, and when they arose and looked back, there was merely a gaping hole where the leading tank had been. The second tank suddenly seemed to rise in the air and fly into millions of tiny fragments, and a second thunderous blast sent them again to their knees. "Radite!" bellowed Dr. Bird to Carnes. "Imagine the effect if that had been a full charge fired from a completed Breslau gun. Watch the planes now. I think they are going to drop a few eggs on them." The black mist cleared as if by magic, and the platform was in plain view. The big glass dome rolled back into place as the two planes swept over at an elevation of 2,000 feet. From each one a small black cigar-shaped object was released and fell in a long parabola toward the earth. The glass dome which had been closing over the gun platform rolled quickly back, and a long beam of intense blackness pierced the heavens. First one and then the other of the falling bombs disappeared from view into it, and then the black column faded from view. The two bombs fell with increasing speed, but the dome closed over the platform before they struck. The two hit the dome at almost the same instant, and instead of the blinding crash they expected, the watchers saw the bombs rebound from the dome and fall harmlessly into the water. "Stymied," muttered the doctor. "I wonder what other properties that confounded lamp has." He resumed his advance, Carnes and the soldiers keeping abreast of him. When they were within 200 yards of the platform, it rose again, and the transparent dome rolled back. A beam of black shot forth over the swamp, searching them out and hiding them from view. First one and then another felt the effects of the black beam, but the vitrilene which the doctor had provided stood them in good stead, and, aside from a slight shortening of their breath, none of the attackers felt any the worse. "Come on, men," tried the doctor as his athletic figure plowed forward through the breast-deep water. "This is their worst weapon, and it is harmless against us." Cheering, they fought their way toward the platform. It sunk for a moment and then rose again. As the dome swung back, a sharp crackle of machine gun fire sounded, and the water before them was whipped into foam by the plunging bullets. One of the soldiers gave a sharp cry and slumped forward into the water. "Fire at will!" shouted the lieutenant in command. A crackle of rifle fire answered the tattoo of the machine gun, and the sharp ping of bullets striking on the dome could be plainly heard. An occasional shot kicked up a spurt of white dust from the concrete, but the machine gun kept up a steady rattle of fire, and the soldiers kept their heads almost at the level of the water. There came the roar of an airplane motor, and one of the planes swept over the platform 100 yards in the air, with two machine guns spraying streams of bullets into the platform. Two men abandoned their machine gun and crouched under the partially folded back dome as the second plane swept over, and Dr. Bird took advantage of the lull to advance his party a few yards nearer. Again the defenders of the platform rushed to their gun, but the first plane had turned and swooped down with both guns going, and again they were forced to take shelter while the doctor and his force made another advance. The second plane had turned and followed the first, but the defenders had had enough. The transparent dome closed over them and the platform sank into the marsh. With a shout, Dr. Bird led the way forward again. The attackers were within 100 yards of the platform when it again rose above the surface of the water. The guns had disappeared, but in their place stood an airship. It was a small affair with stubby wings, above which were two helicopter blades revolving at high speed. No sound of a motor could be heard. The transparent dome rolled back, and like a bullet the little craft shot into the air, followed by a futile volley from the soldiers. Hardly had it appeared than the two airplanes bore down on it with machine guns going. The helicopter paid no attention to them for a moment, and then came a puff of smoke from its side. The leading plane swerved sharply and the helicopter fired again. The leading plane maneuvered about, trying to get a machine gun to bear, while the second plane climbed swiftly to get above the helicopter and pour a deadly stream of fire down into it. It gained position and swooped down to the attack, but another puff of smoke came from the side of the helicopter, and there was a thunderous report and a blinding flash in the sky. As the smoke cleared away, no trace of the ill-fated plane could be seen. the helicopter hung motionless in the air, as though daring the remaining plane to attack. The plane accepted the challenge and bore down at full speed on the stranger. Again came a puff of smoke, but the plane swerved and an answering shot came from its side. It was above the helicopter, and the shell which missed its mark plunged to the ground. When it struck, there came a roar and a flash, and the whole earth seemed to shake. The helicopter shot upward into the air and forward, both its elevating fans and its propellers whirling blurs of light. The airplane followed at its sharpest climbing angle, but was helpless to compete with its swifter climbing rival. "He's got away," groaned Carnes. "Not yet, old dear," cried the doctor, hopping with excitement. "He isn't safe yet. I never told you, but one Breslau gun had been made, and it is on that plane. It has deadly accuracy and is good for 15 miles. That's Lieutenant Dreen at the controls and Mason at the gun." As he spoke, the plane swung around and made a half loop. For a few yards it flew upside down and then whirled swiftly. As it turned, there came a sharp report and a puff of smoke from its rear cockpit. High above, the helicopter had ceased climbing and hovered motionless. As the plane fired, the helicopter shot forward like an arrow from a bow, and thereby spelled its doom. Not for nothing did Captain Mason bear the title of the best aerial gunner in the Air Corps. He had foreseen what the action of his opponent would be, and had allowed for just such a move. Far up in the sky came a blinding flash and a cloud of smoke. When the smoke cleared, the sky was empty, except for a little scattered debris falling slowly to the ground. "And that's that!" exclaimed Dr. Bird as he finished his examination of the underground laboratory with which the gun platform connected. "The lamp has gone to glory with Breslau's gun model and 2 of the best brains of the Young Labor Party. I am sure that Stanesky was one of those 2 men. I wish the whole gang had been on board." "Don't you think that this is the end of it, Doctor?" asked Carnes. "No, Carnes, I don't. We know that the real brains of this outfit is Saranoff, and Saranoff is still alive. He probably won't try to use his black lamp again, because I will have a defense against it in a short time, now that I have seen it in action. But he'll try something else. The whole object of life to a loyal citizen of Bolshevikia is to reduce the whole world to the barbarous level in which they hold Russia, and they will spare no pains or effort to accomplish it. The greatest obstacle to their success at present is the President of the United States. He is loved and respected by the whole world, and if he is spared, he will forge the world into a great machine for the preservation of peace and universal goodwill. That would be fatal to Bolshevikia's plans, and they will spare no effort to remove him. By the grace of God, we have saved him from harm so far. But until we remove Saranoff permanently from the scene, I will never feel safe for him." "What do you suppose they'll try next, Doctor?" "That, Carnes, time alone will tell." End of Part C. And end of The Black Lamp by Captain S.P. Meek. Section 15 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Phalanxes of Atlans, by F.V.W. Mason. Chapter 1, Part A. The ice suddenly gave way under his foot, hurling Victor Nelson violently forward to lie in the deep snow at the bottom of a tiny crevasse, down which the merciless gale moaned like an anguished demon. "It's no use," he muttered bitterly. "We've fought hard, but we're done for." He lay still, stupidly watching his breath form tiny beads of ice on the ends of the fur which lined his parka. Until that moment he had not realized how thoroughly exhausted he was. Every muscle of his starved, bruised body ached unbearably. It wasn't so bad lying there in the soft snow. He could rest, then look later for the ice hummock behind which the plane lay sheltered. Rest. That's what he needed. A good long rest. But deep within him, a primal instinct stabbed his waning consciousness. "No!" he gasped, and blinked his reddened eyes behind smoked goggles which dulled the shimmer of the aurora. "If I stop, I'll never get up." Shaken by the terrific velocity of the Arctic gale, he numbly clambered to his feet, then stooped with a stiff, awkward motion to retrieve a Winchester rifle which lay half buried in the snow beside the blurred imprint of his body. Wonder if Alden had any better luck? The question burned dully in his brain. Don't suppose so. There can't be anything alive in this god-awful wilderness. As he stumbled on, he found no answer in an unbroken vista of wind-scored ice and drifting snow that, swirling high into the air, momentarily cut off the view of that black line of ice-capped mountains barely visible on the horizon. Yes, if he hasn't found anything, we'll be dead or frozen stiff before tomorrow. His soul, that of a true explorer, revolted, not at the thought of death, but that his and Alden's courageously won discovery of a majestic mountain range, towering high over a polar region, marked unexplored on the maps, would now never be made public. Leaning forward against the merciless icy blast, he painfully picked his way over a treacherous ice ridge, to be faintly encouraged by the fact that the tower-like hummock of ice marking the position of the plane now lay but a few hundred yards ahead. Bitterly he cursed that demon of ill fortune who had sent the blinding snowstorm which had forced down the plane 10 long days ago, at the very beginning of its triumphant return flight to the base at Cape Richards. Since that hour the storm gods had emptied the vials of their wrath upon the luckless explorers. Day after day, cyclonic winds made all thought of a take-off suicidal in the extreme. 3 days ago the last of their food had given out, and he mused, starvation is an ill companion for despair. Slip, slide, and fall. On he fought until the final barrier was reached, and he stood staring hopelessly down into a small natural amphitheater which sheltered the great monoplane. The ship was still there, its engine snugged in a canvas shroud and with the soft dry snow banked up high in the lee of its silver gray fuselage. Numbly, like a man in the grip of a painful coma, Nelson shielded his face with a furry hand to scan the surrounding terrain. Hell! The door block of the igloo they had built was still snowed up. Alden was not there. "He's not back," he muttered, while his body swayed beneath the gale which smote him with fierce, unseen fists. "Poor devil, I hope he hasn't lost the way." All the bitterness of undeserved defeat stung his soul as he started down the incline into the hollow. Suddenly he paused. The rifle flew into the ready position, and his chilled thumb drew back the hammer. What's this? On the snow at his feet was a bright scarlet splash, dreadfully distinct against the white background. While his dazed brain struggled to register what his eyes saw, he looked to the right and left and discovered several more of the hideous spots. Then an object that gleamed dully in the polar twilight attracted his attention. He lumbered forward, stooped stiffly, and caught up a long, half-round strip of bronze. What? Why? Oh, I'm crazy. I'm seeing things. The pain in his empty stomach was now becoming excruciating. To steady himself, he shut his eyes, shook his head as though to clear it, and then looked again at that strip of metal in his hand. Attached to it were 2 slender strips of leather-like straps ending in small bronze buckles. "Why, it's not from the plane," he stammered aloud. "Damned if it doesn't look like a greave the old Greek warriors used to wear to protect their shins." Suddenly alarmed and mystified beyond words, he shuffled forward over the snow, the greave yet clutched in a fur-gloved hand. Presently 2 more objects, already half buried by the stinging, swirling drifts, caught his attention. One was the stock of Alden's rifle, protruding starkly brown from the unrelieved whiteness, and the other was a broken wooden shaft that ended a graceful but wickedly sharp bronze spearhead. "I've either gone crazy," he said, "or I'm delirious. Yes, I must be clean nutty. There couldn't be a human settlement within 1,000 miles. Let's see what happened." On the snow of a little wind-sheltered space behind the igloo, he discovered the unmistakable and ominous signs of a struggle. An indefinite number of footprints, blurred but enormous in size, were marked in the snow. Here and there deep furrows mutely testified how Alden and the enemies against whom he struggled had reeled back and forth in vicious combat over a considerable area. Then, shaken by a new fear, he discovered Alden's left glove and a rag of some peculiar thick material that seemed to have a metallic finish. But what aroused his gravest fears were the numerous splashes of blood that here and there streaked the snow in gruesome relief. Only a moment Nelson stood, shaken by the merciless wind, scanning the piece of bronzed armor between his gloved hands with a fresh interest. It was beautifully fashioned, and decorated at the knee point with the wonderfully wrought figure of a dolphin. If he could only think clearly. But his brain seemed to lie in a red-hot skull. "Whatever's happened," he muttered, "I'd better not waste time. They couldn't have been here so long ago. Poor Alden. I wonder what kind of devils caught him." Even before he had finished the sentence, the aviator had taken up the partially obliterated trail of splattered blood drops. That what he sought appeared to be a marauding party of giants restrained him not at all. The one clear thought burning in his weary brain was that Richard Alden, his best friend, the man with whom he had traveled over half the world, by whose side he had faced many a perilous situation, must at that moment lie in peril, the extent of which he could only surmise. "Must have been about a dozen of them," he said thickly. And holding the Winchester ready, he commenced once more to plod on through the stinging sheets of wind-driven ice particles. More than once he had great difficulty in not losing that crimson trail, for here and there the restless white crystals completely blotted out the splashes. All at once Nelson checked his pathetically slow progress, finding himself on the top of an eminence, looking down in what appeared to be a vastly deep natural amphitheater of snow and ice. At the bottom, and perhaps 100 yards distant, was a curious black oval, from which appeared to rise a dense, wind-whipped column of whitish vapor. "My eyes must be going back on me," muttered Nelson, through stiffened lips. How intolerably heavy his fur suit seemed. His strength was about gone, and that curious black, mouth-like circle seemed infinitely far away. But spurred by fears for his friend, he started downward for the precipitous trail leading directly towards it. Once he stepped inside the crater, he became conscious of a terrific side pressure which gripped him as a whirlpool seizes a luckless swimmer. The wind buffeted him from all angles, dealing him powerful blows on face and body, which, too strong for his weary body, sent him reeling weakly, drunkenly, across the hard glare ice towards the vortex. Twice he slipped, each time finding it harder to arise, but at last he approached what on closer inspection proved to be a subterranean vent of black rock. "Steam!" he gasped. "It's steam coming out of there!" Swayed by a dozen conflicting emotions, he paused, the Winchester barrel wavering like a reed in his enfeebled grasp. "The whole thing's crazy," he decided. "I must be frozen and lying somewhere delirious. Poor Dick. Can't help him much now." Like a man in a nightmare who advances but feels nothing under his feet, Nelson staggered on towards that huge, gaping aperture of black rock. On the threshold a pool of melted snow water made him stare. "Hell!" he said. "It's only a volcanic vent of some kind." Then dimly came the recollection of Eskimo legends concerning thermal springs beyond the desolate and unknown reaches of Grantland. His mind in an indescribable turmoil, Nelson splashed across 100 yards of sodden snow, then shivered on wading knee-deep through a pool of melted ice. Now he stood on the very threshold of that awful opening, dense clouds of vapor beating warmly against his chilled features. His goggles fogged at once, blinding him effectively, as, with reason staggering under the accumulated stress of starvation and the circumstances of Alden's disappearance, he groped his way a few feet into the vent. With his left hand he pulled up the glasses from his sunken, bloodshot eyes. "It's warm, by God!" he cried in astonishment as the skin exposed by lifting the goggles came in contact with the air. "Must be some kind of earth-warmed cave." Increasingly mystified, he caught up his rifle and strode on down the passage, at that moment illuminated by the last unearthly rays of the aurora borealis. A single dazzling beam played before him like a powerful searchlight, to light a high-vaulted tunnel of basalt rocks which were distorted by some long-gone convulsion of the earth into 100 weird cleavages and faults. For that brief instant he found he could see perhaps 100 feet down into a high-roofed passage, along the top of which poured a tremendous stream of billowing, writhing steam. "If this doesn't beat all!" he murmured. but for all of his apprehension he did not pause. Those bloody splashes bespeaking Alden's pressing need urged him on. "Looks like I'm taking a one-way trip into hell itself. Well, we'll soon see." Slipping and sliding over an almost impassable array of black rocks and boulders, Nelson fought his way forward, conscious that with every stride the air grew damper and warmer. Soon trickles of sweat were pouring down over his chest, tickling unbearably. Then all at once the ray of light faded, leaving him immersed in a blackness equaled only by the gloom of a subterranean vault. He stopped, and resting his rifle against a nearby invisible rock, threw back the parka hood and pulled off his gloves. He was amazed to feel how warm the strong air current was on his hands. "Beats all," he muttered heavily. "I wonder where they've taken Alden." Meanwhile his hands groped through fur garments now wet with melted snow and ice particles, searching for the catch to open that pocket in which lay a small but powerful electric flashlight, an instrument without which no far-flying aviator finds himself. After a moment's fumbling, his yet stiffened fingers encountered the cylindrical flash, and with a low cry of satisfaction he drew it forth to press the button. "Mighty useful. The words stopped, frozen on his lips. Before the parka edge his close-cropped hair seemed to rise, and his breath stopped midway in his lungs. Sharp electric shocks shook him, for there, half revealed in the feeble flashlight's glare, was a sight which took his sanity to the snapping point. Not 50 feet away, two large eyes, large as dinner plates, with narrow vertical red irises, were trained on him. Rooted to the ground by the paralysis of utter horror, Nelson saw that their color was a weird, unhealthy greenish white, rather like the color of a radiolite watch dial. Strangely intense, these huge orbs wavered not at all, filling him with an unnamable dread, while the strong odor of musk assailed his nostrils. The flashlight slipped from between Nelson's fingers, and no longer having his thumb on the button, flickered out. Helpless, Nelson stood transfixed against a boulder, aware that the strange musky scent was becoming stronger. Then to his ears came a dry scrabbling as of some large body stealthily advancing. Those horrible, unearthly eyes were coming nearer. Fierce, terrible shocks of fear gripped the exhausted aviator. Then the impulse of self-preservation, that most elementary of all instincts, forced him to snatch up the rifle, to sight hastily, blindly, between those two great greenish eyes. Choking out a strangled sob of desperation, Nelson made his trembling finger close over the cold strip of steel that must be the trigger. Like a stage trick, the cavern was momentarily lit by a strong orange-yellow glare. Then the Winchester's report thundered and roared deafeningly. Coincidentally arose a nerve-shattering scream. An exhalation, foul as a corpse long unburied, fanned his face. Terrified, he flattened to the rock wall as a huge, though dangerously agile body hurtled by with the speed of a runaway horse. Presently followed the sound of a ponderous fall, then a series of shrill, ear-piercing gibberings and squeakings, like those of a titanic rat, squeaks that rang like the chorus of hell itself. Gradually they grew fainter, while in the darkness the heavy air of the tunnel became rank with the odor of clotting blood. End of Part A. Section 16 of Astounding Stories 14, February 1931. By Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Phalanxes of Atlans by F.V.W. Mason. Chapter 1, Part B. Nelson remained where he was, shaking like a frightened horse and bathed in a cold sweat. "Wonder what it was," he muttered numbly. He broke off, for in the terrible darkness sounded a low but perfectly audible thud, 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 and also the subtle noise of some rough surface rasping gently over the stone. His nerves crisped and shrieked for relief. "It's coming again," he told himself, and ejected the spent cartridge from the Winchester. "No use. It'll get me, but I may as well fight as long as I can." Even stronger grew the musty smell of blood, while that uncanny thud-thud sound continued at regular intervals. Nelson waited, breath halted and finger on trigger, but still the darkness yielded no glimpse of those awful saucer-like eyes. Emboldened, he stooped, and jerking off his left glove, commenced to grope among the boulders. Somewhere near at his feet the flashlight must be lying. Hoping against hope that its fall had not shattered the bulb, he ran his fingers over the cold, damp stones, every instant expecting to feel the clutch of the unseen monster. How tiny, how puny he was! All at once his fingers encountered the smooth, familiar shape of the flash, and he raised it cautiously through the darkness. Patiently he shifted the Winchester to his left hand in order to set the flashlight on the top of a flat rock, pointing it as nearly as he could determine in the direction from whence came those ominous, stealthy sounds. "Guess I'll switch on the light," he decided, "and trust to drop whatever it is before it reaches me." Taking a fresh grip on his quivering nerves, Nelson cautiously cocked the .38-55, cuddled the familiar stock to his shoulder. He sighted, then with his right hand pushed down the catch lever of the flashlight. Instantly a dazzling white beam shot forth to shatter the gloom. The hair on the back of Nelson's hands itched unbearably, while the cold fingers of madness clutched at his brain, for the sight which met his eyes all but bereft him of his wavering sanity. There, belly up, across a low ridge of basalt, lay a hideous reptile, which in form faintly resembled an enormous and fantastic kangaroo. Its scabby belly was of the unhealthy yellow of a grub, a hue which gave way to a leaden gray as the wart-covered skin reached the back. Two enormous hind legs, each thick as a man's torso and each equipped with 3 dagger-like talons, struck out in helpless fury at the air, while a long lizard-like tail threshed powerfully back and forth, scattering ponderous boulders right and left as though they had been marbles. The flashlight being trained as it was, the monster's head and forequarters were invisible, all save 2 very much smaller and shorter front legs, which, like the hinder ones, clawed spasmodically. "The DTs!" gasped Nelson, conscious that he was trembling like an aspen. He suppressed a wild desire to laugh. "Yes, I've gone crazy!" He glanced downwards and leaped swiftly back, for creeping over the stones toward his fur outer boots meandered a wide rivulet of bright scarlet blood. From its surface rose small curling feathers of steam, which, drifting towards the tunnel's roof, merged with that gray, vaporous current flowing steadily towards the sunless Arctic expanse outside. It took Nelson a long 5 minutes to sufficiently recover his equilibrium for action. All he could do was to stare at that grotesque, gargoyle-like creature as it writhed in leisurely and persistent death throes. "Guess I winged it all right. My God, what a nasty beast! Looks like one of those allosaurs I read about in college. It couldn't be, though. That tribe of dinosaurs died out 5 million years ago." Cautiously he scrambled around among the high black stones, casting the searchlight beams before him and holding the Winchester always ready in his hand while trying to recall snatches of paleontology studied at college long years ago. Yes, it must be a survival of one of the carnivorous dinosaurs, he decided, then paused, increasingly conscious of that steady, thudding noise. What caused it? At last he found himself before the creature's gigantic and repulsive head, which lay limp over a blood-bathed stone, huge jaws partially open, and serrated rows of wicked, stiletto-sharp teeth gleaming yellowly in the flashlight's rays. The head in shape was bullet-like, ending in a blunt nose as big as a bushel basket, and in 2 prominent nostrils. The green, lidless eyes were still open, shining faintly, and seemed to follow his movements. But the steaming blood poured with the force of a small hose from between triple row of bayonet-like teeth that curved inward like those of a shark, to splash and bubble freely to the rock floor and to dribble horribly over the warty gray hide. Then Nelson discovered an amazing fact. About the great scaly neck, thick as a boy's waist, was fastened a ponderous collar, set with short, sharp spikes. Nelson gasped. "What in hell?" he cried. "This damn thing's somebody's property." His mind staggered at the thought of dealing with a race that could and would domesticate such a hideous monster. "Well, it's no use standing here," he muttered, wiping the sweat from his eyes. "This isn't getting poor Alden away from those devils." Thud! Thud! In the act of turning he paused, listened once more. Then he discovered to his amazement that the heart of the apparently dead reptile was still beating strongly. He could even see the yellow skin of its belly rise and fall. The effect was grotesque, uncanny. "Of course," muttered the shaken aviator. "I'd forgotten a reptile's ganglions will keep on beating for hours, like that shark we killed off Paumotu. Its heart didn't stop for 5 hours." Leaving the slain allosaurus behind, the aviator limped onwards, doggedly following a trail which wound down, ever onwards, into the depths of the earth. Gradually the air became so filled with steam that he stripped off his fur jumper and trousers. Clad in a khaki flannel shirt, serge trousers, and shoe packs, he paused long enough to count his cartridges, and found there were just 14. Hell! Not very many with which to venture into an unknown abyss. He distributed them in his pockets, and somewhat relieved of the weight of the fur suit, took up his advance, playing the flashlight ahead of him as he went. "Poor Alden," he thought. "I wonder if he's still alive." Every moment expecting to stumble over the mangled corpse of his friend, he hurried on, making better time over the cavern floor, but soon even the lighter clothing commenced to feel oppressive. "Must be the earth's heat," he muttered, while the steam clouds rolled by him like ghostly serpents. "Guess the crust is very thin here.